Marcus Hale snatched the microphone from the range officer's hand before the man could finish his sentence. He didn't ask. He didn't wait. He just took it the way men like him took everything and turned to face the row of American operators standing at the far end of the firing line. His eyes moved past the SEALs, past the Rangers, past the senior NCOs until they landed on her. A woman standing quietly at the edge of the group, arms loose at her sides, expression unreadable. He smiled. Not a friendly smile, the kind that comes right before someone gets hurt. "Want to try, sweetheart?" The laughter hit before the echo died. If you've ever watched someone get publicly dismissed in front of a crowd that wasn't going to defend them, you know exactly what that moment felt like. And if this is your first time here, welcome. Subscribe to the channel right now, drop a comment with the city you're watching from, and stay with me until the end, because I want to see how far this story travels. Now let's go back to that firing line. Because Marcus Hale just made the worst mistake of his career, and he didn't even know it yet. The base didn't look like a place where reputations got destroyed. Joint Training Facility. Braxton sat 40 minutes outside of Colorado Springs, tucked between two ridgelines that kept the wind unpredictable and the shooting conditions honest. It wasn't glamorous. The buildings were painted in that particular shade of government gray that suggested function over pride, and the ranges stretched out behind a chain-link perimeter in long open corridors that had humbled better shooters than most people ever met in their careers. But on that Tuesday morning, the facility felt different. There were more vehicles in the lot than usual. British military plates mixed with American ones. A transport helicopter had landed 2 hours earlier, and the ground crew was still moving gear when the first SAS operators walked through the main gate like they already owned the place. Sergeant First Class Dominic Reyes watched them from the window of the armory office, arms folded, coffee going cold on the desk behind him. "Here we go," he said it quietly. Corporal James Whitfield leaned over his shoulder to look. "They any good?" "The best," Reyes said, "and they know it. That's the part that gets complicated." The joint exercise had been arranged 6 weeks earlier through a bilateral training agreement that neither country's operators were particularly enthusiastic about. Americans didn't love being evaluated. British SAS didn't love sharing range time. But the directive had come down from people with more stars on their collars than anyone at Braxton was going to argue with. And so here they were, two of the most elite fighting forces in the Western world, forced to share a breakfast room and pretend they weren't sizing each other up every 30 seconds. The American contingent included a SEAL team currently in the final week of a stateside rotation, 2 Army Ranger fire teams, and a mixed support and intelligence unit that occupied the quieter end of the barracks. It was from this last group that Lieutenant Sarah Kane emerged each morning at precisely 5 o'clock, running the perimeter road in the dark before anyone else was awake. She wasn't loud about anything she did. She never had been. Marcus Hale noticed her the first morning, not because she stood out, but because she didn't. He had a trained eye for identifying the weakest link in any formation, and his initial read on Sarah Kane was that she was administrative. Logistics, maybe. The kind of person who made sure ammunition crates got signed for and equipment manifests were filed on time. She carried herself without the visible tension that combat operators wore in their posture. And she didn't engage in the competitive posturing that every other person on the base seemed to perform the moment the SAS team walked into a room. He filed her away as irrelevant. That was his first mistake. The joint briefing happened at 0800 in the main operations room, a long rectangular space with projection screens at both ends and folding chairs arranged in uneven rows. The British team took the left side. The Americans took the right. The center aisle might as well have been a border crossing. Colonel Richard Ashby, the American commanding officer, ran the briefing with the kind of controlled efficiency that left no room for grandstanding. He outlined the week's training schedule, the range rotation, the joint evaluation criteria, and the protocols for sharing facilities without anyone turning it into an international incident. "The long-range marksmanship evaluation is scheduled for Thursday," Ashby said, clicking to a slide that showed the range layout and distance markers. "Distance 1,200 meters. Wind variance is expected. All participants are encouraged to attend as observers, regardless of whether they're shooting. This is a learning environment." Marcus leaned towards the man beside him, Staff Sergeant Colin Bridger, and said in a voice just low enough to be plausibly deniable, "Learning environment. That's American for please don't embarrass us." A few of the SAS men smothered grins. Ashby either didn't hear it or chose not to respond to it. He finished the briefing, dismissed the group, and the 2 teams filed out into the corridor with the careful politeness of people who were being watched. It was in that corridor, narrow, fluorescent lit, smelling of industrial cleaner and gun oil, that Marcus Hale first spoke to Sarah Kane directly. She was walking past the door of the secondary briefing room, a manila folder tucked under one arm, moving at a pace that suggested she had somewhere to be. He stepped slightly into her path, not enough to constitute a block, but enough to require acknowledgement. "You on the range rotation?" he asked. She stopped, looked at him. Her eyes were a flat, steady gray that gave away nothing. "I'm aware of the schedule," she said. "That's not what I asked." He smiled again, the comfortable smile of a man who expected to be found charming. "You shooting Thursday, or are you the one sorting the targets afterward?" She held his gaze for exactly one beat longer than was comfortable. "I'll be there," she said, and walked around him. He watched her go, turned to Bridger. "Admin," he confirmed. "Definitely," Bridger agreed. Neither of them gave it another thought. The first 2 days of the joint exercise moved in the way military training always moves. Controlled chaos punctuated by long stretches of procedural boredom. The teams ran tactical simulations in the morning, cleared shoot houses in the afternoon, and spent their evenings in a fragile approximation of camaraderie that occasionally produced actual conversation and more often produced competitive silence. Sarah Kane moved through all of it like a current beneath the surface. She was present in every exercise. She completed every rotation. She did not seek attention, did not offer opinions unless asked, and did not react to the quiet commentary that followed her through the week. When a British Lance Corporal named Jeffries made a remark within her earshot about the American Support Branch sending its secretary to play soldier, she didn't turn around. She adjusted the sight on the rifle she was cleaning, set it down with deliberate care, and picked up her logbook. Ramirez saw it happen. Specialist Daniel Ramirez was 26 years old, perpetually undercaffeinated, and possessed of the particular social sensitivity that comes from spending 4 years as a military intelligence analyst who people consistently underestimated. He had worked alongside Sarah Kane for 11 months, and in that time he had constructed a theory about her that he shared with exactly no one, because sharing it required him to explain things he technically wasn't supposed to know. He pulled up a chair beside Corporal Whitfield in the break room that evening and tried to sound casual. "You ever look at Kane's service file?" he asked. Whitfield was reading something on his phone. "Why would I? Just curious." Ramirez wrapped both hands around his coffee mug. "There's a 5-year gap in her record. Classified. The access code on the block is one I've never seen before." Whitfield looked up now. "You tried to access it?" "I work in intelligence. I access things. It's literally my job." Ramirez set down the mug. "The code on her file isn't even in our system's registry, which means it didn't originate from any of the standard classification tiers. Someone outside the normal chain put a lock on that file, and the key doesn't exist in any database I can reach." Whitfield was quiet for a moment. "What's the header on the block?" Ramirez said it carefully. "Ghost unit, access denied." The words landed with a weight that neither of them immediately acknowledged. "Never heard of it," Whitfield said finally. "Nobody has," Ramirez said. "And I've been asking, carefully. Nobody has heard of it. There's no record of a program by that name in any declassified archive, no reference in any after-action report. I can access nothing." He paused. "And there are 7 stars marked in her service history, not the standard commendation markers. Different, like a classification identifier." Whitfield folded his phone and put it face down on the table. "You're saying she's not logistics." "I'm saying I have no idea what she is," Ramirez said, "and that makes me nervous in a way I can't fully explain." Across the base in the smaller of the 2 operator barracks, Sarah Kane sat on the edge of her bunk and field stripped her rifle in the dark. She didn't need the light. Her hands had done this 10,000 times in conditions that made darkness feel like a luxury. She worked by feel and muscle memory, each component separated and laid on the wool blanket in the exact order she'd learned in a facility whose name no longer appeared in any official document. She wasn't thinking about Ramirez. She wasn't thinking about Marcus Hale. She was thinking about Thursday. Not because she was nervous. She hadn't been nervous on a range in years. She was thinking about the wind patterns she'd mapped since Monday, the way the crosswinds funneled between the 2 ridgelines and produced a 3-second lull every 7 to 9 minutes, depending on thermal changes. She was thinking about the Barrett in its case at the foot of her bunk. Old, yes. Scratched, yes. Not the most recent model, but calibrated to her specific grip tension, to the particular way she controlled her exhale, to a trigger pull that had been adjusted by hand until it felt like an extension of her nervous system. People saw an old rifle and assumed it reflected the shooter. Sarah had learned long ago that assumption was a door she could walk through. Wednesday passed with increasing tension. The SAS team had performed well in the tactical exercises, and the performance had hardened Marcus Hale's confidence into something approaching arrogance. He was good, genuinely good, and he was not wrong to know it. His shooting record was exceptional. His tactical decisions under simulated pressure were textbook. He carried himself with the authority of a man who had been tested and had not failed, and that authority was real. What it wasn't was complete. He walked the range Wednesday afternoon with his shooting partner, a quiet Scotsman named Taggart, who said little and observed everything. They paced the distance, checked the target configurations, discussed wind. Americans have some solid shooters, Taggart said, not as a compliment, but as a neutral assessment. They're best ones, Marcus agreed. The SEAL on lane 3, Brooks, he's exceptional. I've seen his scores. 6 of his 8 shots at 1,000 meters last month were sub-MOA. What about the woman Kane? Marcus made a dismissive sound. She's not in the rotation. She's support staff who somehow ended up on the range list. Someone probably forgot to remove her name when they updated the manifest. Taggart said nothing. He looked down the range for a long time. You sure about that? I know what I saw in that briefing room, Marcus said. Body language tells you everything. She's not a shooter. Taggart nodded slowly. He didn't argue, but he filed the conversation away in the part of his mind that kept track of things that felt slightly off. Thursday arrived with a cold front that dropped the temperature 10 degrees overnight and pushed the wind into an irregular pattern that the range meteorologist flagged as challenging. The long-range evaluation had drawn observers from both teams plus 3 senior NCOs, 2 junior intelligence officers, and Colonel Ashby himself, who stood at the far end of the scoring table with the expression of a man waiting to see which direction an argument was going to go. The format was straightforward. Each shooter would fire 5 rounds at 1,200 meters. Scores would be calculated on impact cluster measurement and positional discipline. First shot placement carried additional weight. The SAS team shot first by agreement, and they were impressive. 3 of their 5 designated marksmen posted exceptional groups. Marcus shot fourth, and his 5 rounds clustered in a pattern so tight it provoked genuine applause from the American observers. He stood up from the firing position and stretched his back, and the smile was already in place before he turned around. That was when he did it. He crossed to the range officer's table, picked up the handheld microphone that was being used for score announcements, and scanned the American lineup. His eyes found Sarah Kane standing at the far left edge of the group, arms at her sides. Not holding a rifle, not looking particularly engaged, he keyed the mic. Before we moved to the American rotation, he said loud enough for everyone on the line to hear, I want to formally extend an invitation. He let the pause stretch, let the attention gather. To our support staff, he looked directly at Sarah. Want to try Sweetheart? The British team laughed. Not all of them, Taggart didn't, and 2 others stayed quiet but enough. And among the American group, the response was worse, a hesitation, a collective failure of nerve that lasted exactly long enough for the moment to become real. No one stepped forward to object. No one said a word. Sarah looked at Marcus. She held his gaze for 3 full seconds. Set up a firing position, she said. The laughter crested and then shifted. Not gone, but uncertain now, because her voice had carried no anger in it, no embarrassment, no attempt to recover dignity. She had spoken the way someone speaks when they have already decided what's going to happen and are simply waiting for the logistics to catch up. Marcus raised an eyebrow. You sure distance is 1,200? It's not a paper target at 50 meters. I know what 1,200 meters is, Sarah said. He gestured magnanimously at the firing line. Then be my guest. She walked to her bag. No one moved to help her. She unzipped the case herself and lifted out the barrette, and she heard the reaction run through the crowd like water finding its level. The rifle was old. The stock showed years of contact wear. The finish on the barrel was uneven from field conditions, and someone had wrapped a section of the grip in aged 5.5. Cord that had darkened to the color of old leather. Beside her, she heard a British corporal say quietly to the man next to him, Is that a Barrett? The old configuration. M82, the other man confirmed. That's decades old. What's she doing with a museum piece? Sarah set the rifle on the sandbag rest without rushing. She reached into her shirt pocket and pulled out a small field notebook, the kind with a waterproof cover, and she opened it to a page of numbers. She checked the numbers, looked down the range once, then looked up. She was watching something. Her eyes tracked the vegetation at the 800-meter marker for a long moment, then moved to a piece of flagging tape someone had tied to a stake at the edge of the range at 300 meters. Then she looked up at the sky. She wrote 3 numbers in the notebook. She closed it. She got behind the rifle. Marcus crossed his arms and waited. He was still smiling. Around him, the crowd had gone quieter than it had been all morning, and that quiet was growing, not the attentive silence before a good shot, but the uncomfortable silence that comes when people aren't sure how to feel about what they're watching. Sarah controlled her breathing. She had a way of going still that was different from ordinary stillness. Most people, when they concentrate, show effort the small physical betrayals of conscious focus. Sarah Kane went still, the way a lens goes still when it achieves focus. There was no strain. There was only alignment. She exhaled. She fired. The round left the barrel, and the concussion rolled down the range. Everyone looked at the target screen where the electronic scoring system would register impact. The system pinged. The number came up. Dead center. The silence that followed lasted longer than it should have. Long enough to be uncomfortable. Long enough for 3 people to check the screen a second time, as if they expected it to change. Marcus unfolded his arms. He said nothing. Sarah worked the bolt, brought the crosshairs back, adjusted for one variable, just one the smallest correction, and fired again. The scoring system pinged. Same hole. Someone made a sound that wasn't quite a word. A SEAL named Brooks, who had shot a remarkable group himself earlier in the morning, took 2 slow steps forward to see the screen better, and then stopped moving entirely. 3rd shot, 4th shot, 5th shot, 5 rounds, 1 hole. The range officer walked to the electronic display and stared at it for a long moment, then turned to Colonel Ashby. He didn't say anything. He just turned to Ashby with an expression that clearly asked whether this was something that needed to be explained or something that needed to be documented. Ashby walked forward slowly. He looked at the screen. He looked at Sarah, who had brought the rifle off the rest and was quietly clearing the chamber. He looked at the Barrett, old, worn, impossible, and he made a sound low in his throat. Son of a... He stopped himself, pressed his lips together. Someone get me a range camera, readout. The range officer scrambled for his tablet. Marcus Hale was still standing where he had been standing when Sarah fired. He had not moved. His arms were at his sides now. The smile was gone, not replaced by anger, not replaced by anything readable, just gone. The way a light goes out when the power cuts. It was Taggart who finally said it. Not loudly, just loud enough for the men around him to hear. That's Ghost Unit precision, Taggart said quietly. No one on the SAS team laughed at that. No one on either team did. Because every person on that range who had spent enough years in this business knew that there were some levels of accuracy that ceased to be about technique and entered the realm of something older and less easily named, a quality that belonged to people who had been somewhere most operators never went, who had made shots that no one was ever going to read about in any report that carried an unclassified header. Bridger turned to Taggart. What did you say? I said what I said, Taggart replied. Sarah finished clearing the rifle. She set it back on the bag rest with the same methodical care she'd used to lift it. She picked up her field notebook. She stood. Marcus took 1 step toward her. He wasn't sure why. He wasn't ready to speak yet, and he knew it, but his body moved before his plan was in place, and he ended up standing 3 feet from her with nothing prepared. She looked at him, waited. That was, he started. 1,200 meters, she said. I know what 1,200 meters is. She picked up her rifle case. She walked off the line. Behind her, the range had not recovered its noise. People were talking. She could hear it starting, the low, urgent murmur of a crowd that has witnessed something. It doesn't have a framework for it, but no one was laughing anymore. No one was making remarks about support staff or administrative assignments or museum pieces. Brooks caught up with her at the edge of the range. He fell into step beside her without announcement, the way people do when they need to walk and think at the same time. Kane, he said. Brooks, a pause. 5 shots, 1 hole. That's what happened, she said. He was quiet for several strides. I've been shooting for 11 years. I've seen some things. I've never seen that. You've probably just never been standing in the right place when it happened, she said, and nothing in her voice suggested she was being modest. Brooks thought about that for a long time. They reached the equipment shed, and he held the door. She walked through. There's a gap in your service file, he said. 5 years. I heard Ramirez mention it. She set the rifle case down on the bench, turned to look at him. Ramirez talks too much for an intelligence specialist. He's curious. He's good at his job. Brooks leaned against the door frame. Ghost unit. That's the access code on your block. She opened the case and began the field strip sequence she'd done 10,000 times before. Her hands moved without her attention. Is there a question you want to ask? Were you ever going to say anything about who you are? She lifted the bolt carrier and inspected it out of habit. I showed up. I signed in. I did the work. She set the component down. When exactly was I supposed to make an announcement? You weren't, he said after a beat. I understand that now. The shed was quiet. Somewhere outside, the range had found its voice again, and she could hear the elevated pitch of multiple conversations happening simultaneously, the particular sound of people renegotiating a reality they thought they understood. Brooks pushed off the doorframe. For what it's worth, I think half those guys are going to apologize before dinner. Half, she repeated. The other half are going to pretend it didn't happen and avoid you. She looked up at him. For just a moment, the flat gray steadiness of her expression shifted into something that might in the right light have been the beginning of a smile. That's fine, she said. I know how to be invisible. She turned back to the rifle. And behind her across the base, the story had already started moving, passed from mouth to mouth, distorted by repetition, enlarged by disbelief, carried by people who had stood on that range and watched 5 rounds find one hole at 1,200 meters with a rifle that looked like it belonged in a museum. Some of them would remember it accurately. Some of them would exaggerate. All of them would remember that the woman they had called support staff had walked to the line, pulled an old Barrett out of a worn case, and done something that none of them, not even the best of them, could explain away. And Marcus Hale, who had handed her the microphone and the stage without understanding what he was doing, sat alone on a bench outside the main building and stared at the ridgeline. He was trying to remember the last time he had made a mistake of this size. He was having trouble coming up with a comparison. Inside the armory, Ramirez had pulled up Sarah's file again on his secured terminal. He stared at the ghost unit block. 7 stars, 5 years of silence, a classification code that didn't exist in any registry he could access. He thought about the shots. Thought about the particular quality of stillness she had gone into before she fired. He thought about the fact that she had not looked surprised by any of it. Not the laughter, not the silence after, not any of it. Like a woman who had been in rooms much louder and much more dangerous than a training range in Colorado and had learned long ago that the only response worth giving was the one that came at the end of the barrel. He closed the file. He opened it again. 7 stars. He stared at them for a long time. The story moved faster than Sarah did. By the time she had finished cleaning the Barrett and returned it to its case, the version of events circulating through the base had already grown beyond what had actually happened. People who had been standing 40 feet away were describing it as if they had been positioned directly behind her. People who had heard it secondhand were using words like impossible and never seen anything like it with the conviction of eyewitnesses. That was the nature of this kind of thing. When something happens that the human mind doesn't have a ready category for, the story fills in around it, like water filling a depression in stone. Ramirez tracked 3 separate versions before dinner. The first version was accurate, more or less. 5 rounds, 1 hole, 1,200 meters. A rifle that should not have been capable of that kind of grouping in those wind conditions. The second version had her firing without using the sandbag rest at all, standing unsupported, which was not what happened, but was the kind of detail that attached itself to legends, because it felt like it should be true. The third version, which Ramirez heard from a ranger corporal who had gotten it from a British lance corporal who had been on the far end of the observation line, had her correcting for a wind shift mid-string without breaking her firing position. This one, Ramirez suspected, might actually be accurate. He had been watching her hands and her adjustments between shots, and there had been one moment between the second and third round where her right hand moved a 1/4 inch that didn't correspond to the standard bolt manipulation sequence. He hadn't been sure what he was seeing at the time. He was more sure now. He kept that version to himself. The mess hall that evening operated at a frequency that was different from the previous 2 nights. Conversations that would normally have died out after 10 minutes stretched long. Tables that had been arranged by nationality the first 2 nights showed small, deliberate gaps where people had chosen to sit closer to the opposite team than was strictly necessary. Not out of friendliness exactly, out of proximity to information. Marcus Hale did not eat in the mess hall. Bridger brought him a plate and found him sitting at the work table in their shared quarters staring at a ballistics chart he had pulled from somewhere and was now using as a surface to think on rather than read. Bridger set the plate down, pulled up a chair, said nothing. That lasted about 4 minutes. "Talk," Marcus said without looking up. "About what?" "About what everyone is saying. I need to hear it from someone who isn't going to editorialize." Bridger considered this. "They're saying she's not what she presented as. They're saying the rifle was calibrated in a way none of the armory staff recognized. They're saying the notebook she used had calculations that Brooks looked at afterward and couldn't fully reconstruct." Marcus looked up now. Brooks looked at her notebook. She left it on the bench when she went to talk to the range officer. He didn't take it. He just looked at the open page. Bridger paused. He said the wind adjustment formula she was using wasn't any standard notation system he recognized. He's been shooting competition level for a decade and he couldn't identify the method. Marcus was quiet. He picked up a fork, looked at the food set, the fork back down. "Taggart said ghost unit," he said. "I heard him. Do you know what that means?" Bridger met his eyes. "No, and that's the problem, isn't it? If I knew what it meant, we'd know what we're dealing with. The fact that neither of us has ever heard it, that means something." "Everything classified has a name," Marcus said. "Someone always knows the name." "Unless the program was cleaned," Bridger said quietly. "Unless the design was that nobody knows. Unless the whole point was that the people inside it don't exist in any system that someone like us would ever be authorized to access." Marcus pushed back from the table, stood, walked to the window which looked out at the parking area and the distant tree line now black against the sky going purple with the end of the day. "I called her sweetheart on a public address system," he said. "Yes." "In front of both teams?" "Yes." "And she didn't react?" "No," Bridger said, "she didn't." "What does that tell you?" Bridger thought about it for a real moment, not a polite pause. "It tells me that whatever she's been through, whatever that gap in her file is, it produced somebody who has been in situations where losing composure wasn't an option. Not embarrassment, not anger, not anything." He leaned back in his chair. "She didn't react because whatever you said to her was the least dangerous thing that had happened to her in years." Marcus stood at the window for a long time without speaking. In the intelligence office at the far end of the administrative building, Ramirez had been cleared out by a senior NCO at 2100 and told the terminal was closing for the night. He'd complied, gathering his things with the measured pace of someone who was being watched, and walked out into the corridor. He had, before leaving, photographed 2 things. The first was the access code block on Sarah's file. The second was the 7-star identifier in her commendation record, not the commendations themselves, which were buried under the same classification wall as everything else, but the visual marker. 7 small stars arranged not in a row, but in a specific pattern he had noticed on his third look. He studied the photograph in his bunk room, holding his phone close to his face in the dim light. The stars were arranged in a cluster of 3 and a cluster of 4, separated by a specific distance. He had seen a formation like that before, not in any service document, but in a briefing slide he had processed 14 months ago as part of a signals intelligence package that had come through his workstation, flagged for routing only, not analysis. He had routed it. He had not been authorized to read it, but he had seen the header before the file closed. 7 stars, and beneath them 2 words: Ghost Protocol. He had routed it to a general whose name he was not going to write down tonight. His hands were not quite steady when he put the phone away. Across the base in the small communications room adjacent to the armory, Sarah Kane was on a secure line. The call lasted 9 minutes. She did not pace during the call. She stood at the window, the same posture she used everywhere, back straight, weight evenly distributed, facing the room rather than the glass. "The evaluation was today," she said when the other party spoke. A pause. The voice on the other end was male, older, measured. She had known it for years. "And," the voice said, "it went as expected," which means, which means exactly what you'd expect it to mean when someone hands you a stage. A beat. Hail's good, better than the file suggested. Taggart is exceptional. If you want my honest assessment, the British team's third shooter Kellerman is the one worth watching. He didn't draw attention to himself, which in my experience is always the more interesting choice. And your status? My status, she repeated with a flatness that wasn't quite amusement, is that I am now the subject of at least 3 conversations I can identify and probably 6 I can't. The file is drawing attention. Ramirez accessed it twice today. Ramirez is cleared. Ramirez is curious, which is more dangerous than cleared. She turned slightly from the window. He routed the protocol signal 14 months ago. I flagged it at the time. If his memory is as good as his access record suggests he's already making connections, I'd rather he didn't make yet. A longer pause. Do you want him contained? No, I want him watched. Her voice carried no drama in the word. It was a logistical preference, not a threat. He's too smart to suppress and too honest to redirect easily. The best play is to let him ask the question and control where the answer comes from. Understood. The voice shifted slightly. The primary timeline is unchanged. You have until Sunday? I know the timeline, she said. And if Morrison arrives before then? She looked out the window at the dark tree line. Then we accelerate. She ended the call, stood in the quiet room for a moment. Then she went back to her bunk and slept in the clean, total way that only people who have made their peace with their situation can sleep. The next morning hit the base with the kind of institutional awkwardness that follows an event nobody has the official language to address. The joint schedule called for a combined tactical exercise, building clearance, close quarters simulation, stress inoculation drills. Normal work. The kind of thing that should have reset the atmosphere by forcing everyone's attention back to function. It almost worked. Marcus Hale ran the simulation with the precision and authority that had built his reputation, and watching him work, it was genuinely impossible not to respect what he was. He moved through the shoot house with the economy of someone for whom violence had become a language he no longer needed to translate, and his team followed his lead with the coherence of a unit that had been through real fire together. But twice during the exercise, Sarah Kane was assigned to the same clearance team as 2 of the SAS operators, and both times the dynamic in that 4-person unit was not what it would have been the day before. She was still quiet, still positioned herself where she was most useful rather than where she was most visible. But the operators around her moved differently when she was present, a fraction more alert, a fraction more careful. The way people move when they understand that the person beside them is seeing the room at a different level of resolution than they are. Taggart noticed it. He said nothing. He filed it. At the mid-morning break, Brooks fell into step beside Ramirez near the water station and said without preamble, "You found something." Ramirez looked at him sideways. "What makes you say that?" "Because you've had the same expression since last night, and it's the expression you had 6 months ago when you pulled the intercept that turned out to be the Marzina cell." Ramirez was quiet long enough that it became an answer. "I'm not cleared to discuss it," he said finally. "You're not cleared to discuss it with most people." Brooks kept his voice level and low. "Am I most people?" Another pause. "Ghost protocol," Ramirez said in a voice that was barely a voice at all. "Not ghost unit, ghost protocol. There's a difference." Brooks waited. "Ghost unit is the operational designation," Ramirez said. 7 operators. The program ran under a sister authority to JSOC, but off the formal command chain. No budget line, no after-action filing requirement, no official roster. He turned the water cup in his hands. Ghost protocol is the standing order that governs what happens to the program's records if the unit is ever compromised, dissolved, or, and this is the part I couldn't stop thinking about, reactivated. Brooks looked at him directly. Reactivated. The protocol has 3 phases. Phase 1 is erasure happened. Phase 2 is dormancy happened. Phase 3 is... Ramirez stopped, pressed his lips together. "I only saw the header. I didn't read the document." "But you routed it." "I routed it to a general." "Which general?" Ramirez looked at his water cup. "Morrison," he said. "General William Morrison." The name landed. Brooks stood very still. "Morrison," he repeated. "He's not assigned to this facility," Ramirez said carefully. His posting is the Pentagon, Joint Special Operations Directorate, but he's listed as the primary authority on the Ghost Protocol Standing Order, which means he's stopped again, which means he has a direct operational connection to whoever Ghost Unit is. Brooks finished. Was, Ramirez said. Or is, that's what I don't know. They both looked across the exercise yard to where Sarah Kane was reviewing a clearance diagram with two rangers pointing to something on the schematic, with one finger explaining something that was making both rangers nod with the particular nod of people receiving information they wished they'd had earlier. She knew what she was doing yesterday, Brooks said. The shot. She wasn't performing. She wasn't proving something to Hale. No, Ramirez agreed. Then what was she doing? Ramirez thought about it. Thought about the phone he hadn't been able to trace. The secure line request that had gone through the communications office at 2100 and been logged as routine. The 9-minute duration. The flag on the outgoing encryption tier that matched a protocol he had seen exactly once before. I think, Ramirez said very slowly, that she was making herself visible. On purpose. I think yesterday was not a reaction to Hale. I think it was a decision that was made before Hale ever opened his mouth. Brooks absorbed this. He looked at the water in his cup, looked up. She wanted us to start asking questions. She wanted someone to start asking the right questions, Ramirez said. And she needed it to happen fast enough that it looked organic. Why? Ramirez put his water cup down on the table beside the station. That's the question I can't answer yet. He paused. But I think we're going to find out before this week is over. And I think when we do, it's going to change the shape of something much bigger than a range evaluation. The afternoon exercise concluded at 1600. The base moved into the post-training rotation equipment checks debrief. The unofficial hour when the most honest conversations of the day happened, because the structure had relaxed enough for people to say things they'd been holding since morning. Marcus Hale found Sarah Kane at the equipment bench outside the armory. He had thought about what he wanted to say since the previous afternoon. He had drafted and discarded 4 or 5 versions in the architecture of his own mind, rejecting each one for reasons that had more to do with pride than precision. He had settled finally on something close to the truth, which was uncomfortable enough that he had walked to the bench twice before actually stopping. She was breaking down a different rifle this time, not the Barrett, a more recent configuration, and she was moving through the process with the same absence of wasted motion she brought to everything else. He stopped 2 feet from the bench. That was a real shot yesterday, he said. She didn't look up. Yes. I've been shooting for 14 years. I know. He paused. You know my record. I know most of the records in this exercise. She set down the component she was holding. Looked at him. Yours is exceptional. Your first shot at 1200 yesterday was cleaner than anything I've seen from a standing SAS marksman at this distance in a crosswind. He hadn't expected that. He worked to keep it off his face and mostly succeeded. You were watching my shot. I was watching everyone's shot. And still, she confirmed. He stood with that for a moment. I owe you an apology, the microphone, the remark. Yes, she said, just that. He had expected either dismissal or grace, and she gave him neither. Just the plain acknowledgement that he was right. I made an assumption, he said. You made several, she said. The first one was the assumption that the way someone carries themselves in a room tells you what they're capable of. The second was that a piece of equipment's age reflects the quality of the person using it. The third was that because I didn't react to your remark, I didn't have the standing to respond to it. He absorbed each one. They were accurate. He respected accuracy. None of those assumptions were correct, he said. No, she agreed, they weren't. A silence stretched between them that was not entirely uncomfortable. He looked at the rifle on the bench, looked back at her. Ghost unit, he said. Something in her expression shifted, not much, but enough. Where'd you hear that, Taggart? And he heard it from his own memory, not from anyone on my team. He met her eyes. He's been around long enough to recognize something that isn't supposed to exist. Taggart is smart, she said. Not a compliment, a calibration. What I want to know, Marcus said, is whether any of this, the exercise, the range evaluation yesterday, whether any of it is what it looks like. She picked up the component she had set down, resumed her work. What does it look like to you? It looks like a training exercise, he said. It increasingly feels like something else. She said nothing. Her hands kept moving. Kane. I'm not cleared to answer that question, she said. and you're not cleared to ask it. But she said the fact that you're asking it tells me something useful. He waited. She did not continue. He recognized with the particular frustration of a man unused to being managed that she had just told him something while telling him nothing, and that the something was deliberate. He nodded slowly, straightened. I'll find out on my own. Most people do, she said. The question is whether they find out in the right order. He walked away from the bench with the distinct sensation of a man who has begun a conversation he doesn't know how to finish. Inside the operations building, the message had arrived on the secured command channel at 1547, routed through the facility communications office, and flagged for Colonel Ashby's eyes. His aide had brought it to him during the debrief and watched Ashby read it twice, which the aide noted because Ashby never read anything twice. Ashby folded the message, tucked it into the breast pocket of his uniform, dismissed the debrief early without explanation, and walked to his office where he stood at his desk for a full minute without sitting down. Then he picked up his phone and made a call. He's coming, Ashby said when the line connected. The response was brief. Ashby closed his eyes for a moment. When Owen, another brief response. Saturday, Ashby confirmed. He paused. Does she know? The answer to that question was the one that made him finally sit down. Because the answer was probably. Because the answer was she may have known before any of us. And that more than anything that had happened on the range the previous day, more than the impossible grouping and the Warren Barrett and the 7 stars in a sealed file, more than Ghost Unit and Ghost Protocol, and the encrypted identifier that Ramirez had been too careful and too smart to talk about openly, that was the thing that told Ashby he had a completely different situation on his hands than the joint training exercise he had been managing since Monday. He sat at his desk and looked at the message again. The message said that General William Morrison had departed Washington at 00:0600 that morning. The message said he had not informed the Pentagon of his destination. The message said his aide had listed the purpose of travel as a personal inspection. And the message said that his travel itinerary, when Ashby's contact had finally been able to pull, it showed a direct routing to Colorado Springs. Ashby put the message back in his pocket, looked at the wall of his office, thought about the woman on the range who had put 5 rounds through one hole with an old rifle and an older method and had not looked surprised by any of the reaction it produced. He thought about what it meant that Morrison was coming. He thought about what it meant that nobody had told him. He thought finally about the 7 stars. And for the first time in a very long career, Colonel Richard Ashby felt like the least informed person in a room he was supposed to be running. Ashby didn't sleep that night. He spent 3 hours at his desk working through what he knew in the order he knew it, trying to build a picture that held together under pressure. What he kept arriving at was not a picture, but a question, and the question was this: if Morrison was coming to Braxton without informing the Pentagon, without filing a standard inspection request, without notifying the facility commander through any of the usual channels, then Morrison was not coming for the joint exercise. Morrison was coming for something that existed underneath the joint exercise. And the only thing underneath the joint exercise that Ashby hadn't fully accounted for was Sarah Kane. He pulled her file at 0100 using his command access and sat with it for 40 minutes. What he could see told him almost nothing. What he couldn't see told him everything. The Ghost Unit block was absolute, not partial, not redacted with visible structure behind the redaction, but genuinely absent a wall with no seams, no edges, no indication of what it was covering except the access code itself and the 7-star identifier that sat at the top of the block like a signature from a world he didn't have clearance to enter. He closed the file at 0145 and made a decision that he knew was going to cost him something. He picked up his phone and called the one person on this base who had looked at that identifier and recognized something in it. Ramirez answered on the second ring, which meant he hadn't been asleep either. My office, Ashby said, now. Ramirez arrived 4 minutes later, which on a base this size meant he had been close enough that he was already moving before the call ended. He sat across from Ashby with his hands on his knees and his face carefully composed. Ashby put his hands flat on the desk. I need you to tell me everything you know about Ghost Protocol, not what you're cleared to know. Everything you actually know. Ramirez looked at him for a long moment. Sir, that's a conversation that could end my career. Your career is the least complicated thing in this room right now, Ashby said. Talk. And Ramirez talked. Rashan, He laid it out in the order he'd assembled it, the access block, the routing slip from 14 months ago, the signal header he shouldn't have seen, the general's name attached to the protocol standing order. He spoke for 11 minutes without stopping, and when he finished, the office was quiet enough that both men could hear the ventilation system in the ceiling. Ashby said, "You think she made that shot on purpose? Not as a response to Hale, as a signal." "Yes, sir." "A signal to whom?" "To whoever was going to be watching the base's communication traffic for a specific kind of event." Ramirez leaned forward. "If you run a deep cover operator in a low-profile assignment for long enough, the challenge isn't maintaining cover. It's finding a way to communicate that you need to accelerate a timeline without using any of the channels that could be monitored by the people you're watching. A public event, something that generates base-wide chatter and a flood of routine communication, gives you noise cover. You can move your actual message inside the noise." Ashby was quiet. She generated the noise on purpose. Yesterday afternoon, following the range evaluation, there were 47 individual communications from this facility that went out over standard channels. Personal messages, informal reports, at least a dozen texts between personnel with outside contacts. Any one of those could have carried a secondary message using a pre-established code. And nobody would have flagged any of them because they all looked exactly like what you'd expect people to send after watching something remarkable happen on a range. Ashby sat back. He looked at the ceiling for a moment. "What is she watching, Ramirez?" "I don't know," Ramirez said, "but I think it's someone in this building." The silence after that sentence was of a different quality than the silence before it. "Someone in this building," Ashby repeated. "The Ghost Protocol document I routed it had a secondary flag attached to it that I didn't recognize at the time. I looked it up afterward. It was a counterintelligence marker. Specifically, it's used when a program's security has been compromised by a source with internal access." Ramirez met Ashby's eyes. "Someone with authorized access to Ghost Unit's operational records accessed them from outside the normal command structure. The protocol standing order was triggered not because the unit was dissolved, but because the unit was burned from inside." Ashby felt the information reorganize his understanding of the week like a physical shift. Someone in the intelligence community. Someone with a level of access that would require either very senior rank or a very specific kind of placement. Ramirez paused. "Or both. And Kane is here because whoever burned the unit is still active and still looking." Ramirez's voice dropped. "7 operators, sir. Ghost Unit had 7 operators. If someone is hunting them, they need to be found first." The base did not know any of this at 0300 on Friday morning. What the base knew was that Thursday had been extraordinary. Friday's schedule was posted, and the joint exercise had 2 days remaining before the British team rotated out. The SAS operators who were awake at that hour were either on watch rotation or, in the case of Taggart, sitting in the common room with a cup of tea and a service manual he wasn't reading, thinking about a conversation he had had 7 years ago with a man who had used the words "ghost unit" in a context he hadn't fully understood at the time. Taggart had a long memory. It was one of his most useful professional qualities and one of his most inconvenient personal ones. The man had been a signals officer, semi-retired, working as a contractor. He had said the words in passing as part of a longer sentence about why certain mission parameters in a specific theater had produced results that didn't match any conventional doctrine. He had said the words and then moved on to another topic, and Taggart had filed them in the part of his memory reserved for things that didn't make sense yet. Standing on the range and watching Sarah Kane put 5 rounds through one hole, the file had opened. He finished his tea, made another, and when Marcus came through the common room at 0530, Taggart was still there. Marcus stopped. "You haven't slept." "I slept an hour." Taggart looked up. "Sit down." Marcus sat. "I need to tell you something I should have said on the range," Taggart said. "When I said Ghost Unit Precision, that wasn't a figure of speech. I wasn't being dramatic." "I know," Marcus said. "I've heard the term before, specifically from a source I trusted." Taggart set down his cup. "The program produced 7 operators over its operational life. The selection criteria were classified, but the word I got was that every operator in the unit was drawn from existing special operations forces, each one the best of their specific discipline. They weren't trained to be generalists. They were trained to be absolute in one thing and competent in everything else." "And Kane's discipline," Marcus said. Precision fire at extreme range under active operational conditions, Taggart said. Not range conditions, not controlled environments. Real conditions, moving targets, compromised positions, incomplete data. He looked at Marcus steadily. The record in her file, if the number I heard is accurate, the longest confirmed shot that unit ever made was over 2,000 meters. Under fire, with a spotter who was wounded and couldn't communicate past the first calculation. Marcus said nothing for a long moment. Who took that shot? Taggart picked up his cup again. The record doesn't have a name attached to it. It has a star. The morning exercise began at 0800 and ran with the mechanical efficiency that characterized the joint schedule's final stretch. But the undercurrent running through both teams had a charge in it that hadn't been there on Monday. People were more careful, more attentive. There was a quality of focus that had shifted from competitive to something less defined but more serious, and it was coming, Brooks noted from both sides equally. He ran the first clearance evolution with two SAS operators he hadn't worked with closely before Kellerman and a quiet Welshman named Price, and what he found in the shoot house was that these were not men who needed to be watched. They moved with the kind of competence that doesn't announce itself, and by the end of the sequence, the three of them were communicating in the abbreviated shorthand of people who understand the same language. In the debrief afterward, Kellerman said, "Your unit's solid, Brooks, all of it." "Thanks," Brooks said. "Yours too." A pause. "Including Taggart." Kellerman looked at him sideways. "Taggart's in a different category than the rest of us, and he knows it. He just doesn't make it anyone else's problem." "Like Kane," Brooks said. "Like Kane," Kellerman agreed. They stood with that for a moment, the easy recognition between two professionals that certain people occupy a different altitude and that the appropriate response to that fact is neither resentment nor worship, but simply accurate accounting. At 10:40, Sarah Kane was called to Ashby's office. She had been expecting it since 0300. She had heard Ramirez's footsteps in the corridor, his particular walk weight slightly forward on the left foot, the tell of an old ankle injury at 0150 heading toward the administrative wing. She had noted the time turned over and waited for the shape of the day to declare itself. She sat across from Ashby. Ramirez stood to the left behind Ashby's desk with the posture of a man who had said too much and was waiting to find out whether that had been the right decision. Ashby looked at her. "I'm going to ask you one question." "All right," she said. "Is there a threat on this base?" She held his gaze. "Not yet." Ashby absorbed that. "Not yet," he repeated. "The threat is in transit," she said. "And before you ask me to explain, that I need you to understand that what I tell you from this point is going to change your role in this situation. You can ask me to stop. I would recommend you don't." Ashby straightened slightly. "Keep going." Ghost Unit ran for 5 years under an authority that sat between JSOC and a civilian intelligence directorate whose name I'm not going to say in this room. 7 operators, 43 confirmed operations, 0 mission failures. She spoke without affect the way people recite numbers that belong to a part of their life they've made peace with. The unit was burned 18 months ago. Someone with access to the classified roster identified our operators and began passing information to a foreign intelligence network. We lost 2 people before the protocol was activated. The unit was erased. Operators were dispersed into cover assignments. "Cover assignments," Ashby said, "like a support role at a joint training facility. The exercise was a convenient structure. It wasn't the reason I'm here." "Why are you here?" She looked at Ramirez briefly, then back to Ashby. "Because the person who burned us has a connection to someone attending this exercise. A meeting was scheduled through back channels that I've been tracking for 11 weeks. A contact, an exchange, information that would allow the person who burned Ghost Unit to identify the remaining 5 operators." She paused. "If that information transfers, 5 people die." The room was absolutely silent. Ramirez had gone still the way he went still when a piece of intelligence shifted from abstract to immediate. Ashby pressed both hands flat on the desk. "Who is the contact?" "Someone on this base," she said. "I don't have a confirmed identity yet. I have a behavior signature and a communication pattern. I've been narrowing it for 72 hours. "And Morrison," Ashby said, "he's coming because." "He's the protocol authority," she said. "He was notified when I accelerated the timeline. The shot yesterday, it was a communication. It confirmed to Morrison that the operation was active and moving forward. Ashby leaned back slowly. He looked at the ceiling. He looked at Ramirez, who looked back at him with the expression of a man who had correctly identified that the situation was serious, but had not quite grasped the full dimensions of serious. "The contact meeting," Ashby said. "When?" "Saturday," Sarah said, "which means the contact is on this base right now and has been since Monday." Ashby stood up. He walked to the window. He stood there for 30 seconds, and in those 30 seconds, Sarah could see him doing the same reorganization of understanding that everyone did when they moved from believing they were managing one situation to understanding they were inside a completely different one. He turned back. "What do you need from me?" "I need the communications log for this facility from Monday to now, all of it. I need Ramirez cleared for full collaboration, and I need you to tell no one on this base, not your aide, not your senior NCO, not anyone in the joint chain that this conversation happened. And the exercise continues as scheduled." "Exactly as scheduled," she confirmed. "The contact cannot know the timeline has been identified. If they sense movement and the meeting cancels and we lose the opportunity." Ashby nodded once, the nod of a man who has transferred authority to someone better suited to exercise it, and who is honest enough with himself to recognize that fact without requiring it to be stated diplomatically. "The logs will be on your terminal in an hour," he said. She stood. "One more thing." She looked at him directly. "Morrison is going to arrive Saturday morning. He's going to do something in front of both teams that will look ceremonial. It isn't. It's the final step in breaking cover. When it happens, I need everyone on this base to be present." "Why?" "Because the contact needs to see it happen. They need to understand in that moment that whatever they plan to transfer is now already in the wrong hands." She paused. "Fear makes people move, and moving people make mistakes." She walked out of the office. In the corridor, she slowed her pace and let the weight of the conversation settle through her, the way weight always settles after a period of sustained performance. Not relief, not tension release, but simply the recalibration of a system that has been running at a specific output level and is now adjusting to the next phase. She had 72 hours. She had a communications log that would take her 4 hours to process. She had a contact she could not yet name, but whose behavior pattern she had been watching since Tuesday. Without their awareness, the small deviations from expected conduct, the moments of attention that lasted a fraction too long, the communications that went out at times that didn't match the pattern of someone who was simply being a professional in a stressful environment. She went to the communications terminal that Ashby had cleared for her and started working. By 1300, she had reduced the field from everyone on the base to 11 people. By 1500, she had reduced it to 4. By 1700, she had 3. At 1722, she found the message. It was embedded in a routine equipment status report filed at 2315 on Wednesday, the night before the range evaluation, the night before she had made herself visible. The report was filed by someone whose job gave them administrative access to range communications, and nested inside the standard formatting of a logistics update was a sequence of numbers that looked like a parts inventory reference code, but wasn't. She ran the sequence through a cipher she had been given access to 6 months ago when the surveillance operation began. The decoded text was 11 words. She read them twice. Then she sat very still for a moment, in the particular stillness that comes not from calm, but from the moment of recognition, when a long calculation arrives at its answer, and the answer is worse than the alternative possibilities you had been carrying. She pulled up the personnel file of the person who had filed the report. She looked at the name for a long time. Then she picked up the phone. Morrison answered on the first ring. "I have the name," she said. A pause. Then his voice, older and steadier than hers, carrying the weight of a man who had built the unit she had served in and had spent 18 months trying to protect what was left of it. "Tell me," he said. She told him. The silence that followed lasted long enough that she checked the line to make sure it was still connected. "Are you certain?" he said finally. "The cipher doesn't lie," she said, "and the behavior pattern matches everything I've been tracking since Tuesday." She paused. "You know this person?" "Yes," Morrison said, "I do." "How well?" Another pause, longer than the first. "Well enough that this is going to be the hardest thing I've done in 30 years, he said, "but not well enough to let it stand." She said nothing. She understood in the way that people who have served understand that there are moments when the right thing and the human thing are separated by a distance that only certain kinds of people can cross. Morrison had crossed distance like that before. He would cross this one. "I'll be there tomorrow morning," he said, 0700. "The base will be assembled," she said. "And Kane." His voice shifted slightly. Not softer, just more careful. "The other four, they're safe for now." "For now," she said. "After tomorrow, they'll be safe for good." She ended the call. She sat at the terminal for a moment longer, looking at the name on the screen. A name that belonged to someone who had eaten in the same mess hall as her for 5 days. Someone who had attended the same briefings, stood on the same range, occupied the same institutional space, and breathed the same air, and participated in the ordinary machinery of professional life with enough fluency that nothing had looked wrong. That was always how it was. The most dangerous people never looked dangerous. They looked like colleagues. They looked like professionals. They looked from the outside exactly like the people around them, because the ability to look like the people around you was the first and most critical skill that a certain kind of person learned. Sarah had learned it too. The difference was what you did with the skill. She closed the terminal, stood, rolled her shoulders once the single physical concession she allowed herself to the tension of the day, and walked out of the communications room into the corridor, where the base was moving through its evening rotation with the ordinary rhythm of people who didn't yet know that everything was about to change. Marcus Hale was in the car corridor. He stopped when he saw her, read something in her expression, not the surface of it, which gave away nothing but the quality beneath the specific kind of stillness and that he now understood was not absence of feeling, but extreme management of it. "Something happened," he said. She looked at him, assessed, made a decision. "Tomorrow morning," as she said, "be in the main yard at 0700. He held her gaze. "Is it over?" "Almost," she said. She walked past him. He turned and watched her go and felt the particular weight of a man who has spent a week being wrong about everything and is now standing at the edge of understanding what the truth actually looks like. It was heavier than he expected. It was also in some way he couldn't articulate, yet more important. Nobody slept well that Friday night. It moved through the base the way certain kinds of pressure always move. Not announced, not explained, but felt in the body the way weather is felt before it arrives. People stayed up later than usual. Conversations died out faster than they should have. The mess hall cleared early, and the common rooms filled up and then emptied again. And by 2300, most of the base was in their quarters, doing the thing that soldiers do when something is coming and they can't name it yet. They check their gear. They clean things that didn't need cleaning. They lay in the dark and stared at ceilings. Marcus Hale lay on his bunk and thought about the word almost. Almost, she had said. Not finished, not resolved. Almost. Which meant there was a distance still to cross, and the crossing was going to happen in the morning, and whatever happened in that crossing was going to determine something larger than the joint exercise that had brought them all to this base in the first place. He had run through everything he knew, and what he kept arriving at was the same conclusion. Ramirez had arrived at the same conclusion Taggart had arrived at, approached from different angles, but landing in the same territory. Sarah Kane had not come to Braxton to be evaluated. She had come to complete something, and the range and the microphone and the shot had been instrumental in the completion, not incidental to it. What he couldn't determine was what the something was. At 0100, he gave up on sleep. He dressed and walked to Taggart's room and knocked twice softly, the way you knock when you know someone is awake. Taggart opened the door immediately. He was fully dressed. "You too?" Marcus said. "Since 2200, Taggart confirmed. He stepped back and let Marcus in. They sat on opposite ends of the room in the way men who have served together for years can sit in silence, without it being uncomfortable, until Marcus said, "She told me to be in the main yard at 0700. "She told me the same thing," Taggart said, "an hour ago in the corridor." Marcus looked at him. "She's moving people into position." "She's been moving people into position since Monday," Taggart said. "We were just too busy being impressed with ourselves to notice." Marcus absorbed that without argument because it was accurate. There's a contact on this base. Someone who was going to transfer information. Yes. Ghost units remaining operators. Yes. And she's identified them. Taggart said, "I think she identified them before she arrived. I think the operation was already at its conclusion point when she walked through that gate on Monday. Everything since then has been the final sequence." Marcus was quiet for a moment. The shot, he said. She wasn't proving anything to me. No, Taggart said. She wasn't. I handed her exactly what she needed. Taggart looked at him steadily. You did. Marcus sat with him. It was not a comfortable thing to sit with the understanding that you had been useful not as a participant, but as a prop, that your arrogance had been a tool someone else picked up and used with precision. But he had always been the kind of man who could take an uncomfortable truth and hold it without flinching. And so he held it. When Morrison arrives, he said, everything becomes official, Taggart said. And official is the end of operational cover, which means whoever the contact is, they'll understand that the window closed, that what they were planning to transfer is now in the wrong hands. And they'll move, Marcus said. People always move when the window closes, Taggart confirmed. The question is which direction. At 0400 in the communications room, Sarah Kane was on her third hour of final preparation. She had the communications log fully processed, the cipher decoded, the behavior timeline charted in the narrow field notebook that she had been carrying since Monday. She had a name. She had a method. She had a motive chain that ran from the burned unit 18 months ago through a series of intelligence transfers that had cost 2 people their lives, through 11 weeks of surveillance work to a personnel file she had looked at for a long time in the blue light of a terminal screen. What she had not fully prepared for was the feeling, not emotion exactly. She had managed emotion in far worse situations than this and knew how to do it well enough that it didn't interfere with function. This was something subtler. A particular weight that comes with the end of a long operation, the accumulated pressure of sustained performance, months of watching and waiting and calculating, and now the final hours before it resolved into something permanent and real. 2 of her people were dead because of the person whose name was in her notebook. That was the weight. She allowed herself to feel it for exactly 30 seconds. Then she closed the notebook and went back to work. At 0600, the base began to wake in its normal Friday rhythm, then paused, recalibrated, felt the charge in the air that it couldn't explain, and woke faster than usual. By 0645, the mess hall had moved through breakfast in an accelerated cycle, and by 0650, the word had passed through both teams by routes that Sarah had not explicitly arranged, but had anticipated be in the main yard at 0700. People came, not because they were ordered to. There was no formation, call, no official assembly, nothing on the schedule that corresponded to what was being asked. They came because the week had built to something and they could feel it, the way you feel the end of a sustained chord before it resolves, and the instinct of trained people in that kind of moment is to be present for what comes next. By 0658, the main yard held both complete teams plus the facility's senior NCOs plus Ashby, who stood at the edge of the assembled group, with his hands behind his back and his face carefully neutral. Ramirez stood near the back. His hands were in his pockets, and his face was not as neutral as he would have liked. Sarah Kane stood at the front. She was not in her usual position at the edge, unobtrusive, functionally invisible. She was standing in the center of the open space, and this alone was enough to shift the quality of attention in the yard because everyone present had developed over the course of this week a specific sensitivity to Sarah Kane's spatial choices, and standing in the center was not a choice she made casually. At 0659, a vehicle pulled through the main gate. It was a standard military transport, no markings beyond the base access plate, and it pulled to a stop at the edge of the yard with the kind of deliberate positioning that it says the person inside knows exactly where they are going and what they intend to do when they get there. General William Morrison stepped out. He was not what most of them expected, and the disconnect was immediate and visible in the yard's reaction. A subtle collective adjustment, the physical recalibration of people who had formed an image and are now replacing it with the real thing. Morrison was in his late 60s, built like a man who had spent decades in the field and had never entirely left it, with a face that had been weathered by enough years and enough decisions to have the particular quality of someone who has run out of room for things that don't matter. He wore no dress uniform. He was in service dress, no ceremonial additions, and he walked across the yard with the unhurried pace of a man who has decided what he is doing and is no longer in negotiation with himself about it. He stopped in front of Sarah Kane. He looked at her for a moment. Just looked the way you look at someone you haven't seen in the 18 worst months of your professional life, someone whose survival represents a calculation you made and are profoundly relieved to find was correct. Then he pushed back his left sleeve. On his forearm, a mark that several people in the yard would later describe differently, depending on how close they were standing and how well they knew what they were seeing. What those close enough to see it clearly understood it to be, was a tattoo. A serpent consuming its own tail, small and precise, and encircling it 7 stars. Arranged in the same pattern that Ramirez had photographed from her service file. 3 and 4 separated by a specific distance. He held it there for a long moment. Then he rolled his sleeve back down. "Lieutenant Kane," he said, his voice carried in the yard without requiring volume. "General," she said. "For the record," he said, and his voice had taken on the particular register of formal address, the kind that means what is said is being said for more than the immediate audience. "You are no longer operating under cover designation." "Understood," she said. "Ghost unit is being formally acknowledged," he said. Partially within the limits of what can be acknowledged without endangering the remaining personnel. He paused. "Your service record as of this morning has been partially declassified. The operational details remain sealed. The outcomes do not." The yard was absolutely still. Morrison reached into his jacket. He produced a small case, not a presentation case, not ceremonial, just the plain protective case that military decorations travel in when they are being moved from one place to another with the intent of being used rather than displayed. He opened it. Inside, 3 decorations. The yard was not close enough for most people to read them, but Brooks was close enough, and what he saw made him very still for a moment before he composed his expression. 43 confirmed high-value eliminations. Morrison said, not reading from anything, reciting from a record he knew by heart. 98% operational accuracy across all Ghost unit engagements. 0 mission failures in a 5-year operational period, and 1 confirmed record engagement at a distance and under conditions that I am not going to read aloud in this yard because some of the people present are not cleared for the theater it occurred in. He looked at her. "You know the number." "I know the number," she said quietly. "Do you want it stated?" She considered. "No." He nodded. "Except it's this. Pin the first decoration. For operational conduct resulting in the protection of American intelligence assets in 3 consecutive theaters," he said. He pinned the second. For actions under direct fire that preserve the operational integrity of Ghost Unit at the cost of your cover identity and required an 18-month stand-down. He paused with the third. The yard had stopped breathing. "And for the operation completed at 0400 this morning," he said, "which identified the source of Ghost Unit's compromise, preserved the safety of 4 remaining operators, and produced actionable intelligence that will be processed by the relevant authority beginning at 0900 today." He pinned the third. He stepped back, looked at her, and then in front of 2 complete special operations teams, in front of senior NCOs, an intelligence specialist and a British SAS sergeant who had handed her a microphone 5 days ago, with a smirk, General William Morrison came to attention and saluted Lieutenant Sarah Kane. He held it. The yard held its breath. One by one, it started with Brooks, then moved through the American team, then crossed the aisle and reached the British side where Taggart was already coming to attention. Before the movement had fully arrived, the assembled personnel came to attention and saluted. Marcus Hale was the last. Not because he hesitated, because he wanted to do it right, because he understood in this moment that the salute he was rendering was not a formality and not a performance and not a recovery from anything. It was an honest accounting. It was the thing you give when you have been wrong about everything and are now standing in the presence of the correct answer. He came to attention. He saluted. She returned it. Held the return for 1 beat longer than protocol required. Not a statement, just a choice. Morrison lowered his salute. "At ease," he said to the yard, and the released breath of 40 people was nearly audible. He turned to Ashby. "Colonel, I need your secondary briefing room in 30 minutes. "It's ready, sir," Ashby said, with the tone of a man who had prepared it at 0500 on the basis of an educated guess that turned out to be correct. Morrison nodded, turned back to Sarah, spoke quietly enough that only she and the 2 people immediately adjacent could hear. "The contact is in custody as of 20 minutes ago," he said. "Federal authority, off-base team, clean." She received this without visible reaction. "The transfer package, intercepted," he said. "Complete, nothing went out." She nodded once. He looked at her for a moment longer. "You did this without backup. 11-week single operator, no support team. I had support, she said. He raised an eyebrow. She glanced briefly at Ramirez, at Brooks, at Ashby, who was studiously not listening from 6 feet away. Morrison followed her glance, looked at the 3 men she had indicated, looked back at her. They didn't know they were supporting you, he said. The best support usually doesn't, she said. He almost smiled. It was a near thing. Brief me at 0900, everything. He walked toward the building. His aide fell into step behind him. The yard began to decompress slowly, the way pressure releases after something that has been building for days finally finds its resolution. Voices came back in stages. Movement returned. People drifted toward each other and toward the coffee that someone had the presence of mind to bring out from the mess hall. And the conversations that started were the particular kind of conversation that begins in the aftermath of something significant. When people are trying to locate themselves relative to what just happened. Ramirez found Sarah at the edge of the yard. He stood next to her, said nothing for a moment. You knew I'd find the access block, he said finally. I knew you were good enough to find it, she said. I didn't know what you'd do with it. You were counting on me to bring it to someone? I was counting on you to make good decisions, she said. You did. He looked at the 3 decorations on her uniform, looked away. The person, the contact. Is it someone I know? She looked at him. No, they weren't part of the exercise team. They were working through an access channel that required proximity to the base's communications infrastructure. The parts inventory report, he said. She held his gaze. I saw it at 23:15 Wednesday, he said. I almost flagged it. The reference code didn't match any standard format I recognized. I decided I was overthinking it. You weren't, she said, but you'd already found it. Yes, he was quiet. 2 people from your unit died. Yes, and the person responsible. We'll answer for it, she said. The flatness of her voice was not coldness. It was the sound of someone who has made peace with the limits of what they can control and is precise about the territory where they can. Ramirez nodded, looked at his coffee. For what it's worth, if you ever need someone who is good at finding access blocks and making bad decisions into slightly better ones. She looked at him. The almost smile was there again, the one that Brooks had caught a glimpse of in the equipment shed, the one that lived just below the surface of the stillness, and came out when someone said something that was honest and a little self-deprecating and more accurate than they realized. I'll know where to find you, she said. Across the yard, Marcus was talking to Taggart. Their voices were low and the conversation had the quality of 2 professionals who are revising a significant portion of their understanding of recent events. She was never in support, Marcus said. It wasn't a question, it was a statement of completed comprehension. No, Taggart said. The entire week. Everything. Everything, Taggart agreed. The clearance evolutions, the briefings, the range. He paused. She was watching, mapping, completing a sequence that started before we arrived. Marcus looked across the yard to where Sarah was talking to Ramirez, and then looked at the decorations on her uniform, and then looked back at Taggart. 43 confirmed, he said. The general read that as a number. It's not a number. No, Taggart said. It's 43 separate moments where someone like us was the last thing an enemy combatant ever encountered, and the only reason anyone knows they happened is that the record survived when the program didn't. Marcus was quiet for a long moment. She could have said something. On the range, when I handed her that microphone, she could have shut me down with 1 sentence. She could have, Taggart agreed. She didn't. No. Why, Taggart looked across the yard. Because she needed you to hand her that microphone, he said. She needed you to be exactly who you were in exactly that moment in front of exactly that many witnesses. And she trusted that you would be because you hadn't given her any reason to expect otherwise. Marcus absorbed this. She used my arrogance. She used the situation, Taggart said. Your arrogance was part of the situation. Don't flatter yourself into thinking it was the important part. Marcus looked at him. Then unexpectedly, he produced a sound that was very close to a laugh, short, unwilling, genuine. That's the most honest thing anyone said to me this week. I've been saving it, Taggart said. Brooks appeared at Marcus's left shoulder with 2 cups of coffee. He offered one. Marcus took it. They stood in a loose, unlikely cluster, an SAS sergeant, a British marksman who had started the week as an antagonist, an American SEAL, and drank their coffee and looked at the yard where the morning was finally fully arriving. At 08:45, Sarah Kane walked into the secondary briefing room and sat across from Morrison and three people she hadn't seen since the unit went dark 18 months ago. They were intelligence officers, but they wore the particular kind of plain clothing that says we are not here officially, and this meeting is not happening in any format that will appear on a calendar. They had traveled separately. They had arrived separately. They were seated with the careful spacing of people who understand that their physical proximity to each other is itself a form of exposure. Morrison opened with full debrief from the beginning. She talked for 40 minutes. She covered the 11 weeks of surveillance, the communication patterns she had identified, the cipher, the part's inventory message, and its decoded content, the behavioral tells she had cataloged across 5 days of close proximity, the timeline of the contact's planned transfer, the method, the recipient, the channel, the specific package of operational data that would have allowed whoever burned Ghost Unit to locate and identify the 4 remaining operators who were currently in dispersed cover assignments. She talked about the shot, about why she had chosen Thursday, why she had chosen that range, why she had allowed Marcus Hale's challenge to land the way it landed instead of deflecting it. You needed the noise coverage, one of the intelligence officers said, for the confirmation signal. Yes, she said, and I needed the story to travel. The more people talked about the shot, the more organic communication traffic the base generated. 47 outgoing messages in the 3 hours following the evaluation. The contact's message was embedded in the 31st. How did you know they would send in that window? Because the contact needed to tell their handler that the operation was still on schedule, she said. The shot generated enough attention that a careful person might interpret it as a security indicator, something unexpected had happened, and they needed to reassure their handler that the operation hadn't been disrupted. She paused. A nervous person communicates. I needed them nervous. Morrison looked at her. You manufactured a situation designed to make a trained intelligence asset nervous enough to break communication protocol. Yes, she said, using a British SAS sergeant's ego as the mechanism. It was available, she said, and reliable. One of the officers made a sound. It might have been appreciation. Morrison looked at her for a long moment. The 4 remaining operators, he said, they're being notified as of this morning. Their cover assignments will be maintained, but their security protocols are being upgraded. Good, she said. And you, he said, your cover is fully burned. You can't go back into the field under the current identity. I know. We're offering 3 options, he said, and listed them in order. She listened without interrupting. When he finished, she said the 3rd option. He looked at her. That's the hardest one. I know, she said. It's also the one that produces something that lasts past me. The 3rd option was not a field assignment. It was not a return to operational status under a new identity. It was a training program, specifically drawn from the doctrine that Ghost Unit had developed over 5 years of classified operation, the methods and the principles, and the specific quality of thinking that had produced 43 confirmed outcomes, and 1 record that would never be officially spoken aloud in an unclassified room. It was the program that would produce the next generation of operators who could do what Ghost Unit had done. It was the program that would ensure that the people who had tried to erase Ghost Unit had not in the end erased anything that mattered. You'd be building something from scratch, Morrison said. I've done it before, she said. He nodded, looked at his hands, looked up. There's one more thing I need to tell you about the contact. He paused. They've agreed to cooperate in exchange for terms. The cooperation includes identifying the full network, everyone involved in burning the unit, everyone who received the transferred data over the past 18 months. She was quiet for a moment. How many names? Preliminary estimate 14, he said. Possibly more. She looked at him steadily. And the 2 we lost? His face changed. Not much, just enough. Won't be forgotten, he said. I can promise you that. She nodded, once. That was all she needed from that. She stood. He stood. Lieutenant Kane, he said. She looked at him. What you did this week, he said, was the most precise operation I've seen run by a single operator in 30 years of this work. He paused. And I've seen a great deal of this work. She picked up her notebook from the table. A good shot is just calculation, she said. Everything else is patience. She walked out of this briefing room into the corridor, and behind her, the three intelligence officers and Morrison sat for a moment in the particular silence of people who have just witnessed something they will describe to each other in the years ahead, carefully and accurately, because accurate description is the only form of honoring available to people in their line of work. Outside the base was moving through the middle of a Saturday morning that felt to everyone who had been present in the main yard at 0700 like a different kind of day than the days that had preceded it. The joint exercise had 2 hours remaining on its formal schedule. Both teams would run the final evaluation sequence, file the joint performance reports, and complete the administrative closeout that ended a bilateral training agreement. All of that would happen, and underneath it, invisible to the process and the paperwork and the formal record, something else had also concluded, something that would appear in no after-action report, no bilateral document, no personnel evaluation. Only in the memory of the people who had been there, and in 7 stars. The final evaluation sequence began at 1000 with the particular efficiency of people who have stopped performing for each other and are simply working. That was the difference a week made. On Monday, both teams had moved through every joint exercise with the careful self-consciousness of professionals who know they are being watched and are calibrating their output accordingly. On Saturday, the calibration was gone. What remained was function, clean, direct, unadorned, and it was better than anything the week had produced before it, because the best work always happens when the audience stops mattering. Sarah ran the final clearance sequence with Kellerman and a ranger named Ortiz, who she had not worked closely with until Thursday's afternoon evolution. Kellerman moved the way he always moved, economically, without announcement, and Ortiz had the particular quality of someone who had identified the highest functioning person in his proximity and was learning from them in real time without making it obvious. She noted this, filed it. It was the kind of quality that the program she was building would need. She was already building it in her head, had been since she'd said the third option to Morrison, and felt the shape of it settle into place with the certainty of a correctly calculated shot. The clearance sequence ran clean. No errors, no hesitation. When they emerged from the shoot house and Ortiz pulled off his helmet and said, "That's the tightest 3-person evolution I've run since workup," he was not flattering anyone. He was making an accurate assessment, and accuracy was the language everyone on this base had by the end of the week decided to speak. At 10:45, Ramirez found her at the equipment return station and stood next to her with the body language of someone who has been rehearsing a sentence and is now committing to saying it. "I want to ask you something," he said. "Ask," she said, "the program Morrison offered you." He kept his voice low, not conspiratorial but careful. "The training program, is it real? Or is it a holding pattern while they figure out what to do with you?" She looked at him. "Where did you hear about the options?" "I didn't," he said. "I inferred. Morrison offered you something that you accepted, and whatever you accepted, it wasn't a field return and it wasn't a desk. You don't have the posture of someone who just got a desk." He paused. "And you spent 2 hours in that briefing room. Field returns take 20 minutes. Desks take 10. Whatever took 2 hours was something being built." She was quiet for a moment. "It's real," she said. He nodded slowly. "What kind of operators are you building?" "The kind that don't look like operators," she said. "The kind that walk into a room and get dismissed as logistics." She held his gaze. "The kind that survive because nobody sees them coming until it's already done." Ramirez absorbed this. "You're going to need people who can identify that kind of talent. People who understand that the access block in a service file isn't a dead end. It's a door." She looked out at him for a long moment. "I know where to find you," she said, for the second time. But this time it was not a pleasantry, and both of them understood that. He nodded once, walked away, did not look back because he had already decided looking back was not part of the decision. The formal closeout began at 1300 in the main operations room, and it was on its surface exactly what it was supposed to be: a bilateral training debrief, a review of evaluation scores, a ceremonial exchange of unit patches between team leaders, a series of handshakes and photographs for the joint exercise record. Colonel Ashby ran it with the efficient warmth of a man who was genuinely proud of what his facility had produced this week, and the British team's senior officer, a major named Hartwell, who had been conspicuously quiet throughout the exercise, offered a formal commendation of the American team's performance that was specific enough to be real and measured enough to be honest. It was professional. It was correct. It was also for everyone who had been in the main yard at 0700, a surface below which the actual weight of the week resided, unspoken and unrecorded, and more significant than anything the formal record would capture. When Hartwell finished his commendation and the room moved toward the handshake rotation, Marcus Hale crossed the room to Sarah Kane. He stopped in front of her. He did not offer his hand first. He waited. She looked at him. "I've been thinking about what to say," he said, "since Thursday afternoon. I've come up with several versions and discarded all of them." "What's wrong with the versions?" she asked. "They all start with an apology," he said, "and I've realized that starting with an apology puts the focus in the wrong place." She waited. "What I want to say," he said, "is that I've been doing this work for 14 years. I have been in the field in active combat in every evaluation environment this side of classified that exists for operators at my level. And in 14 years, I have never watched anyone do what you did on that range Thursday morning." He paused. "Not the shot, the whole thing. The way you managed every variable, including me, from the moment you walked onto that base. Including using my own arrogance as a mechanism in an operation I didn't know was happening. You were useful," she said. "Not unkind, just precise. I was a prop," he said, "and I was a prop because I made every assumption I've been trained not to make. I saw what I expected to see and stopped there." He met her eyes. "That doesn't happen to me." "It happened to you," she said. "Yes," he said, "it did." He was quiet for a moment. "I need to understand how. Not for pride, for the work. If I can be handled that cleanly by one person in a joint exercise environment, what does that mean for the field?" She looked at him, assessed as she always assessed, with the full spectrum attention that processed everything simultaneously. What she was looking at now was not a man performing humility. It was a man who had run an honest accounting of himself and arrived at a number he didn't like and was not planning to argue with. That was the kind of man the program needed too. "You assumed," she said, "that quietness is weakness, that calm is absence of capability, that the person who doesn't compete for attention in a room has nothing to compete with." She paused. Every assumption was wrong, and each one was wrong in the same direction, which means it's not a single error. It's a pattern. He held her gaze. "How do you correct a pattern like that?" "You stop looking for the person who announces themselves," she said. "You start looking for the person who doesn't need to." He absorbed this. "That's not something you learn in a training manual." "No," she agreed, "it isn't." A pause. "Is there somewhere you learn it?" She looked at him for a long time, long enough that the handshake rotation had completed, and people were beginning to drift toward the doors, and the conversation had moved to the particular private space that exists inside a busy room when two people are talking quietly enough that the noise around them becomes a wall. "There might be," she said, "eventually." He understood what that meant. Not now, not an invitation, not a door currently open, but an acknowledgement that the door existed. For a man who had started the week by handing her a microphone with a smirk, it was more than he had earned, and he knew it. He extended his hand. She shook it. "For what it's worth," he said as he released it. "Taggart said from the beginning." "Taggart always says from the beginning," she said. "That's why he's worth listening to." Marcus almost smiled. "He'll be insufferable about that." "He's earned it," she said. She walked toward the door. He watched her go, and what he felt was not the complicated residue of humiliation, though that was present, and not the competitive recalibration that follows a decisive loss, though that was present too. What he felt underneath all of it was something closer to relief, the specific relief of a man who has discovered that the world contains people better than his best understanding of it, and has decided that this is not a threat but a fact worth building on. Taggart appeared at his elbow, said nothing, looked at the door she had walked through. "Insufferable," Marcus said. "I don't know." Taggart agreed with the particular satisfaction of a man who has been right about something important and is choosing to wear it lightly. At 1500, Morrison called Sarah into the small conference room adjacent to his temporary command space, and this time it was just the two of them. He had a folder on the table. He pushed it across to her. She opened it. Inside was a program outline, 12 pages. The title at the top was not Ghost Unit. It was not any variation of the name she had operated under for 5 years. It was something new, a designation she hadn't seen before, clean and unmarked by history. She read through it carefully. He waited without speaking because he had written it and she needed to read it without his commentary shaping her reception. She turned the last page, set it down. 15 candidates in the first cohort, she said. That's what the selection pool supports, he said. We have identified candidates from 7 different special operations communities. Each one has been flagged by their unit commanders as exceptional in their primary discipline and consistently underestimated by their peers. She looked up, deliberately selected for that quality. Yes, he said, because you've demonstrated that it's not a liability. It's the most sophisticated form of operational cover that exists, and it's entirely natural, which means it can't be faked and can't be trained into someone who doesn't already carry it. He paused. We're selecting for people who already are what the program needs. Your job is to give them what they don't yet know they have. She was quiet for a moment. The 2 we lost, she said. Their doctrine is in here. Everything they developed is in here, he said. Their methodology, their field adaptations. The approaches that only existed in their practice and would have been lost if you hadn't documented them before the protocol was activated. He met her eyes. They're in the program Kane. They don't get erased. She looked at the folder, at the clean new designation at the top of the first page. She thought about a range on a Thursday morning and 5 rounds through 1 hole, and a British sergeant who had handed her a microphone without understanding what he was doing, and 43 operations that existed only in sealed records, and the memories of people who had been there, and 2 names that she carried with the particular weight of the responsible, not guilt, because she had done everything that could have been done, but weight because weight is the honest form of memory. She thought about Ramirez, who had found the door in the access block and knocked on it when a lesser analyst would have walked past. She thought about Brooks, who had asked the right questions without being entitled to the answers. She thought about Ashby, who had transferred authority to the right person with the grace of a man who understood that grace was the professional requirement of the moment. She thought about what it meant to build something that lasted. I'll need full selection authority, she said. I'm not taking candidates whose commanders want to promote them by putting them here. I'm taking candidates whose commanders don't yet understand what they have. You have it, Morrison said. I'll need a facility that isn't attached to any existing training infrastructure. The program can't look like a program. The candidates can't know they've been identified before I've had a chance to assess them in an uncontrolled environment. Already in progress, he said. And the doctrine, she said. What we develop in the first cohort, it belongs to the program, not to the command structure above it. If someone above this program decides the doctrine is inconvenient, it doesn't get buried. It gets protected. Morrison looked at her. You're asking me to build a firewall into the program's own design. I'm asking you to make sure what we build can't be unbuilt by the same kind of people who burned the unit, she said. Yes. He was quiet for a moment. That's going to require institutional trust from people who are not accustomed to being asked for it. I know, she said. So was every Operation Ghost unit ever ran. We delivered anyway. He nodded slowly. I'll have the framework language drafted by Monday. She closed the folder, pushed it back across the table. I don't need to take it with me, she said. I have it. She stood. He stood. One more thing, he said. She waited. He reached into his jacket pocket and produced something small. He set it on the table between them. It was a coin. Not a challenge coin, not the decorative kind that units exchange for morale and memory. It was older than that, worn smooth on the face, the design barely legible from handling. She looked at it without picking it up. On one side, a serpent consuming its tail. On the other, 7 stars, 3 and 4, the pattern she had known since the first day she understood what she had become. This belonged to the unit's first operational lead, Morrison said. He carried it for 4 years. He gave it to me when the protocol was activated. He said to give it to whoever picked up what Ghost unit left behind. He paused. He didn't specify in what form the pickup would happen. I don't think he imagined it would look like this. She looked at the coin for a long time. She picked it up. It was heavier than it looked. Coins like this always were. What was his name? She said. The first lead. Morrison told her. She held the coin. I'll make sure he knows what it built, she said. He'll find out, Morrison said. People like that always do. She closed her hand around the coin and walked out of the conference room, and the door closed behind her with the particular quiet of a room that has just witnessed the last thing it needed to witness. The SAS team departed at 1700. The transport was loaded efficiently with the practiced speed of people who have been living out of bags for a week and can be ready in 40 minutes when the order comes. Both teams gathered in the vehicle bay, not formally, not because anyone organized it, but because the week had produced something between these people that didn't have an official name and didn't need one, and the end of it deserved acknowledgement, even if the acknowledgement was just standing in the same space one more time. Brooks shook hands with Kellerman. They exchanged unit cards, the informal kind, personal numbers on the back, with the understanding of two people who will work together again if the world arranges itself correctly. Ortiz found Price and they had a 10-minute conversation about a tactical problem they had identified in Thursday's clearance evolution that neither of their units had a clean solution for, and they parted with the particular energy of people who have found a productive problem and intend to solve it separately and compare notes later. Taggart found Sarah near the edge of the bay. He stopped in front of her. He was carrying his bag. He had the settled quality of a man at the end of a journey who knows the journey was worth taking. "You were right," she said before he could speak. He looked at her. "About which part?" "About the candidate you flagged in your unit's last evaluation cycle," she said. "The one whose commander rated as underperforming in leadership metrics." He went very still. "How do you know about that?" "I read evaluation reports," she said. "The ones that get filed through the Joint Training Authority. Yours came through 6 weeks ago as part of the bilateral exercise prep package." She paused. "Your commander disagreed with your flag." "My commander was wrong," Taggart said. "Yes," she said, "he was. Don't let the candidate transfer out before I have a chance to assess them." Taggart looked at her for a long moment. His face was doing several things simultaneously, and the one that won was something close to wonder, the particular expression of a man who has spent a week believing he understood the situation and has just discovered that the situation was 3 layers deeper than he reached. "You've been running a selection process," West said, "this whole week." "I've been doing several things this whole week," she said. "Selection was one of them." "Kellerman," he said, "Kellerman is extraordinary," she said. "He'll receive a different kind of invitation." "Price, too early to say. Another 6 months and I'll know." Taggart absorbed this. "And me." She looked at him. "You said ghost unit precision on a public range in front of 40 people, based on watching one string of fire from 30 feet away, drawing on a 7-year-old memory of a conversation that most people would have filed and forgotten." She paused. "I don't need you in the program, Taggart. I need you where you are doing what you just did." He understood. Eyes, not hands. Recognition, not execution. A different kind of function, and she was telling him it was a necessary one. He nodded once. "If you need something from the British side." "I know where to find you," she said. Third time. Different meaning each time. He picked up his bag, looked at her one more time with the steady, calibrated attention that had made him useful all week without his knowing exactly how. "It was a remarkable shot," he said. "It was a calculated shot," she said. "Remarkable is what happens when the calculation is invisible." He walked to the transport, did not look back because he was Taggart, and looking back was not his habit, but she noted that his posture as he walked held something it hadn't held. When he arrived on Monday, a particular quality of a man who has confirmed something he suspected and can now carry it as knowledge instead of intuition. Marcus was last. He had been standing apart from the boarding process, watching it with his arms folded, in the posture she had seen from him all week, the default stance of a man comfortable with authority, but the quality inside the posture was different now. Less performance in it, more weight. He walked to her when the others had boarded. The transport's engine was running. He said, "I'm going to be thinking about this week for a long time." "Most people do," she said, "when something reorganizes them." "Is that what happened to me? I got reorganized?" "You got accurate," she said. "Some people call that the same thing." He looked at her. "The program you're building?" "Yes." "The first cohort?" "Yes." "Is there a version of this where the selection isn't limited to American operators?" he said. She held his gaze. "Is there a version of this where a British SAS sergeant is willing to operate under a command structure that doesn't acknowledge his existence in any official record?" He held her gaze back. "I've been doing that my whole career," he said. "I'm very good at not existing officially." She said nothing for a moment, Let the silence do the work that words would have done less cleanly. The evaluation is ongoing, she said finally. It started Monday, and it doesn't have an end date. He absorbed this, nodded once with the clean economy of a man who has received exactly the answer he needed and understands that pressing for more would cost him what he just gained. He reached into his jacket, produced a coin, the standard British military kind, unit insignia, worn at the edge from years of pocket carry. He set it on the equipment locker beside her without ceremony or explanation. She looked at it. She reached into her own pocket, produced the coin Morrison had given her an hour ago. She set it beside his. 2 coins on a locker, a serpent eating its tail and 7 stars beside a British unit insignia that had been carried in a pocket for 14 years of real work. He looked at the 2 coins, looked at her. You planned that, he said. I planned a lot of things, she said. Did you plan me specifically, or was I just the available mechanism? She considered this with genuine attention the way she considered everything fully without performance. Both, she said. You were the right person in the right place, making the right mistake at the right time. That's not coincidence. That's selection. Something crossed his face that wasn't quite a smile and wasn't quite relief, but occupied the territory between them. Taggart is going to be unbearable when I tell him. Don't tell him, she said. Let him figure it out. He will. He always does, Marcus said. He picked up his coin, left hers. He walked to the transport without looking back because by the end of this week, he had understood that looking back was not the posture of someone who had passed any kind of evaluation worth passing. The transport pulled out at 17:04. Sarah stood in the vehicle bay until it cleared the gate. Then she turned back toward the base and the coin was in her hand, and the weight of it was the same weight it had been when Morrison set it on the table, heavier than it looked, which was the honest condition of things that carry what they carry. Ramirez was waiting at the entrance to the administrative building. He had his jacket on and his bag over one shoulder, which meant he had figured out something before she had told him. Morrison cleared you for a temporary assignment, she said as she reached him. I know, he said. I got the notification 10 minutes ago. He paused. He didn't tell me what the assignment was. No, she said. I told him not to. He looked at her. You're going to tell me in person. I'm going to show you, she said. There's a difference. She walked past him into the building, and after a beat, he fell into step behind her, because that was the correct response, and Ramirez, whatever else he was, had never had trouble identifying the correct response. Inside the base was moving through its late afternoon rhythm, the ordinary machinery of a military facility, at the end of an exercise week, paperwork being filed, equipment being logged, the institutional record absorbing and archiving everything that had happened so that it could be referred to later and used and built on. The official record would show a successful joint training exercise, bilateral evaluation scores above baseline, commendations filed, a visit from a general logged as a personal inspection, and in the personnel section, the partial declassification of a service record that had previously been blocked under a classification code that didn't exist in the standard registry. What the official record would not show was what had actually happened. It would not show a Thursday morning on a range and 5 rounds through 1 hole. It would not show a Friday night debrief that changed the shape of what everyone on this base thought they were part of. It would not show a coin passed between 2 people who had started the week on opposite sides of a microphone and ended it with a shared understanding of what the work actually required. It would not show the program that was already being built in the mind of a woman who had walked onto this base as invisible and was walking off it as the foundation of something that would outlast every record classified or otherwise that her name had ever been attached to. 7 operators, 2 gone, 5 safe, 1 building what came next. And in the training facility that would open its doors 8 months later, in the first evaluation evolution of the first cohort of a program with a new name and an old purpose, 15 candidates would move through a shoot house under assessment conditions they had not been told were assessment conditions evaluated by instructors whose names did not appear on any official roster in a program that did not officially exist. And every one of those 15 candidates had one thing in common. They had all, at some point in their careers, been handed a microphone by someone who thought they were irrelevant. Every one of them had known exactly what to do with it. That was the selection criterion. That was what Ghost Unit had always been, and what it would always be as long as Sarah Kane was the one deciding who made the cut. Not the loudest in the room, not the one who needed to be seen. The one who could walk into any room in any role carrying any rifle and make the shot that nobody saw coming because they had already decided before anyone else knew there was a decision to make that the shot was going to land exactly where it needed to land. That was the doctrine. That was the legacy. That was what 7 stars meant, and what they would always mean long after the names beneath them were no longer spoken aloud in any room that carried an unclassified header. Sarah Kane had not come to Joint Training Facility Braxton to be recognized. She had come to finish something and build something and leave something behind that was harder to erase than a name in a file. She had done all 3, and the work, the real work, the kind that outlasts the people who do it, had already begun. The facility did not have a name. That was the first thing the candidates noticed and the first thing they were instructed not to ask about. It sat in high desert 90 minutes from anywhere, a cluster of low buildings the color of the ground around them, surrounded by terrain that did not forgive carelessness, and weather that changed its mind on a schedule no one could predict. There was no sign at the gate. The road that led to it appeared on no map that a civilian could obtain. The vehicles that came and went carried plates that resolved, if anyone bothered to check, to a shell entity that leased agricultural equipment. 8 months had passed since the joint exercise at Braxton. Sarah Kane stood at the window of the operations building at 5 o'clock in the morning and watched the dark the way she had watched the dark on every base she had ever occupied, and waited for the first of the 15 to begin moving. She did not have to wait long. At 5:02, a single figure emerged from the candidate barracks and began running the perimeter road. Sarah watched without expression. She knew the figure. She had reviewed the file 40 times. Candidate 11, they were not using names yet. The names came later. After the assessment phase resolved who was staying, was a 24-year-old Air Force pararescue specialist whose unit commander had written in the evaluation that flagged her for this program that she lacks the command presence expected of a team leader and tends to recede in group dynamics. The commander had meant it as a criticism. Sarah had read it as a recommendation. She watched candidate 11 run the perimeter in the dark alone at a pace that suggested she had no idea anyone was watching and would have run it exactly the same way if she'd known. That was the quality. That was the thing the file could only hint at and the running could confirm. People who performed for an audience ran differently when they thought they were alone. People who simply did the work ran the same way in every condition, because the work was the point and the audience had never been part of the calculation. Behind her, the door opened. "She's been up since 4:30, Ramirez said. He set a cup of coffee on the windowsill beside Sarah's hand. He had learned over 8 months exactly how she took it and exactly when she wanted it, and he had also learned not to comment on the fact that he'd learned it. Stretched for 20 minutes, checked her gear, then went out. "Did she know you were watching?" "No, I was on the thermal feed." He paused. She field stripped her sidearm before the run, in the dark, reassembled it by feel. Sarah said nothing for a moment, then flagged the file, note the date. Ramirez made the note on the tablet he carried everywhere, now the one that held the only complete record of the program's first cohort, a record that existed on no network backed up to no cloud, duplicated only on a second device locked in a safe whose combination 2 people knew. He had taken the temporary assignment at Braxton, and it had become permanent in the way that the most important assignments always did, without ceremony, without a formal moment of decision, simply by virtue of his being the right person, doing the right work, until the work became who he was. He had spent the first 2 months building the selection apparatus, the methods for identifying the underestimated, the criteria that could not be reduced to a checklist, because the whole point was that the candidates didn't look like candidates. He had spent the next 2 months learning from Sarah how to see. That was the word she used. See, not evaluate, not assess, not screen. See. You can teach a person to read a file, she had told him in the 3rd week. You can teach them to score a shooter and rank a candidate and identify the top performer in a room. None of that is what we do. What we do is walk into a room and find the person everyone else has already dismissed and recognize before they've done anything to prove it that they're the most dangerous person present. She had looked at him. That's not analysis. Analysis comes after. First, you have to see. He had not fully understood it then. He understood it now, watching Candidate 11 run the perimeter in the dark, because 8 months ago he would have looked at her file and seen exactly what her commander saw: a competent specialist who lacked command presence, and he would have routed her somewhere else and never thought about her again. Now he looked at the same file and saw a person who had spent 24 years learning to be invisible, because invisibility was safer than the alternative, and who had turned that survival adaptation into something that could not be trained, faked, or taught. He had learned to see. That was the thing the program built. Not just operators, the people who could find them. The first cohort had arrived 6 weeks earlier in 15 separate vehicles, on 15 separate days, each candidate believing they had been selected for an advanced specialization course in their existing discipline. They had been told nothing about Ghost Unit. They had been told nothing about Sarah Kane, whose name they did not know and would not learn until the program decided they had earned it. They knew only that they had been pulled from their units, flown to a facility with no name, and assigned to a course of instruction that did not match anything in any training catalog they had ever seen. Some of them had figured it out faster than others. Candidate 4, a Marine Scout sniper, had understood by the end of the first week that the assessment was not testing what it appeared to test. Candidate 9, a combat controller, had understood by the second week that the instructors who never gave their names and never appeared in any roster were watching for something the candidates had not been told about. Candidate 11 had not said anything to anyone about what she understood, which was Sarah had noted its own kind of answer. The assessment was simple in structure and brutal in execution. The candidates were given problems. Not training scenarios in the conventional sense, not shoot houses and timed evolutions and standardized evaluations, though those existed too as a kind of camouflage, but problems. Situations with no clean solution, no obvious correct answer, no scoring rubric that a candidate could optimize against. A candidate would be handed a set of constraints and an objective in a deliberately incomplete picture, and then they would be watched, not for whether they solved the problem, but for how they thought when they didn't have enough information and couldn't ask for more. That was the thing Ghost Unit had always selected for, not skill. Skill was a prerequisite, the price of admission, the thing that got a candidate into the pool in the first place. What the program selected for was the quality of mind that could function in the gap, the space between insufficient information and necessary action, where most operators froze or guessed or defaulted to doctrine, and where a very small number of people did something else entirely. They calculated. Sarah had a name for it privately. She called it the still place. It was the thing she went into before she fired the alignment that wasn't strain, the focus that didn't show effort. It was not a skill, and it was not a technique. It was a way of being that a person either carried or didn't, and the entire purpose of the assessment was to find out which candidates carried it. By the 6th week, the picture had clarified. Of the 15, 4 had revealed themselves to be exceptional specialists who did not carry the still place. They would return to their units better than they had left, carrying skills that would serve them and their teams well, never knowing they had been measured against a criterion they hadn't been told about and had narrowly failed to meet. There was no shame in it. Most of the best operators in the world did not carry the still place. The program was not looking for the best. It was looking for the specific. Of the remaining 11, 7 were strong candidates who would advance to the next phase, and 4 had revealed something that made Sarah review their files at night alone in the blue light of a terminal, with the particular attention she reserved for the things that mattered most. Candidate 11 was one of the 4. The test that resolved it came in the 7th week. It was not announced as a test. Nothing in the program was ever announced as a test, because the moment a candidate knew they were being evaluated, the evaluation became worthless. They performed, and performance was exactly the thing the program was designed to see past. The candidates were told they were running a routine navigation exercise. 2-person teams, a 30-kilometer route through broken terrain, a series of checkpoints, a time standard that was demanding but achievable. The kind of evolution that special operations candidates had run 1,000 times in their careers. Nothing about it suggested anything other than what it appeared to be. Candidate 11 was paired with Candidate 6, an Army Ranger with 8 years in and a reputation in his home unit for being the most reliable man in any formation. He was good, genuinely good. He had the kind of competence that announced itself quietly and held up under pressure, And on paper, he was the stronger of the two, more experience, more deployments, a more decorated record. His commander had not flagged him as underestimated. He had been brought into the pool through a different channel recommended by an officer who had served with him and believed correctly that he was capable of more than his current assignment allowed. He carried the still place. Ramirez had confirmed it in the third week, but he carried it alongside something else, a habit formed over 8 years of being the reliable one, of stepping forward, of taking command, of being the person who solved the problem. That habit was the variable the test was designed to expose. 11 kilometers into the route at a checkpoint deep in terrain where the radio coverage was deliberately poor, the two candidates found a third person. He was a program instructor, though they did not know that. What they knew was that they came over a ridgeline and found a man at the bottom of a ravine 15 feet down, a loose scree slope, his leg twisted under him at an angle that meant something was broken, calling up to them in a voice that carried real pain. He told them he was a contractor doing survey work. He told them he'd been down there for 2 hours. He told them his radio was smashed and his partner had gone for help and not come back, and he didn't know how long he could hold on. None of it was true. The instructor was an exceptional actor, and the injury was prosthetic, and the entire scenario had been constructed to present the candidates with a problem that had no clean solution and no scoring rubric and no correct answer that a candidate could optimize toward. Because here was the gap they had a time standard to make. They had a man who needed help. They had poor radio coverage and incomplete information and no way to verify the man's story. They had a route that did not pass near any road. They had 2 people in a 30-kilometer objective and a stranger at the bottom of a ravine, and every choice they could make was wrong in some way, and they could not ask for more information because there was no one to ask. Candidate 6 did what 8 years of being the reliable one had trained him to do. He took command. He went down the slope. He assessed the injury. He started organizing a solution, a litter from their gear, a plan to move the man, a recalculation of the route that would get them to a road where they could flag down help. He was decisive and competent, and he was, in the language of every leadership manual ever written, doing exactly the right thing. Candidate 11 did not go down the slope. She stood at the top and she watched, and Sarah, monitoring the scenario from a position 600 meters away, with a spotting scope and a feed from the instructor's concealed camera, watched her watch. 11 was in the still place. Sarah could see it from 600 meters. The particular quality of stillness that wasn't hesitation, wasn't paralysis, wasn't the freeze of a person who didn't know what to do. It was the stillness of a person who was calculating, who had taken in the whole picture and was running it against everything that didn't add up, and who had not yet committed to action because the picture was wrong and she knew it was wrong, and she was working out how. She had seen the things that 6 in his decisiveness had not stopped to see. The man's hands were clean. 2 hours at the bottom of a scree slope with a broken leg, and his hands were clean and his nails were clean, and there was no scree dust ground into the heels of his palms from the kind of clawing that a person in real pain does instinctively. The man's water bottle clipped to his pack was full. 2 hours in this heat and he hadn't touched his water. The man knew their route. He had referenced a checkpoint by its designation, a designation that a civilian contractor doing survey work would have no reason to know. 11 had seen all of it, and she did not announce any of it because announcing it was what 6 would have done, and 11 was not 6. She came down the slope slowly, and she knelt beside the man as if to help, and she put herself between the man and her partner in a way that looked like positioning for the litter, but was actually positioning for something else. And she said in a voice that carried no accusation and no alarm, "What survey company did you say you were with?" The man gave a name. "And your partner went which direction for help?" The man pointed. "There's no road that way for 20 kilometers, 11 said. "You'd have sent him back the way you came in." "Where's your vehicle?" The man's face did something. A small thing, the thing a face does when a script it has been following hits a line that isn't in the script. And 11, who had spent 24 years learning to be invisible because invisibility was safer, who had been told by her commander that she lacked command presence and tended to recede, looked at the instructor at the bottom of the ravine and said quietly, with no drama at all, "I don't think you're hurt, and I don't think you're who you said you are. And I think this is a test, and I think the test was whether we'd commit to a picture before we'd checked whether the picture was real." The instructor held the act for one more beat. Then he sat up, the prosthetic injury folding away, and he reached for his radio, a working radio, the one that had supposedly been smashed, and he keyed it and said 3 words. 11 sees it. 6 standing 6 feet away with a half-assembled litter in his hands, and the dawning expression of a man who has just understood that the test he was passing was not the test that was being given, looked at his partner with something that was not resentment. It was the beginning of understanding. That night, Sarah sat with Ramirez in the operations building, and they reviewed the day's assessment in the way they reviewed everything, slowly, precisely, without rushing toward conclusions that the evidence hadn't earned. 6 is going to wash to the 2nd tier, Ramirez said. It was not a question, but there was something in it that was checking. 6 is going to be an extraordinary team leader, Sarah said, in a unit that needs an extraordinary team leader. That's not what we're building. She looked at the feed, frozen on the moment 11 knelt beside the instructor. He committed to the picture. He spent 8 years being rewarded for committing to the picture and acting decisively, and 95% of the time that's exactly the right thing, and it makes him exactly the operator his unit needs. But it's not the still place. The still place doesn't commit until it's checked, and it checks in the time most people spend committing. And 11? Sarah was quiet for a moment. 11 is what we're building, she said. She thought about a microphone on a range 8 months ago, and a British sergeant who had handed it to her because he had committed to a picture administrative support staff irrelevant without checking whether the picture was real. She thought about how clean it had been, how reliable, how easy it was to walk through a door that someone had opened by deciding in advance that there was nothing behind it. She thought about 43 confirmed operations that existed because somewhere, at some point, someone had looked at an operator who didn't announce herself and decided she wasn't a threat. The most dangerous people never looked dangerous. That was the doctrine. That had always been the doctrine, and the entire purpose of the program was to find the people who carried it naturally, not the ones who could be trained to fake invisibility, because faked invisibility broke under pressure, but the ones for whom invisibility was simply who they were, a thing they had carried since childhood, a survival adaptation that the program could turn from a liability their commanders complained about into the single most valuable operational quality that existed. She's going to need a name, Ramirez said. She's going to earn one, Sarah said, when she's ready, not before. Marcus Hale arrived in the 9th week. He came the way Sarah had known he would come, eventually not as a recruit, because the British command structure could not formally assign an SAS sergeant to a program that did not officially exist, but through a back channel that Morrison had spent 3 months constructing a liaison arrangement that gave Marcus a reason to be present that would survive an audit and a paper trail that led nowhere. He arrived in service dress with no insignia, in a single bag, and he stood in the vehicle bay of a facility with no name, and when Sarah came out to meet him, he did not smirk. That was the first thing she noticed. He did not smirk, and he did not perform the confidence he had worn at Braxton, and he did not carry himself like a man who expected to be found charming. He had spent 8 months being reorganized, and the reorganization had taken. "Sergeant," she said. "Lieutenant," he said. Then after a beat, "Or whatever you are now, I assume the rank on the door isn't the rank that matters." "The rank on the door is the rank you're cleared to know," she said. "And there's no door." He almost smiled. It was a near thing, and she noted that it was a different near smile than the one he had carried at Braxton, less practiced, more genuine. The expression of a man who had learned that being wrong was survivable and had stopped being so afraid of it. "I'm here as a liaison," he said. "That's what the paperwork says." "The paperwork says a lot of things. What am I actually here for?" She looked at him for a long moment, assessed the way she always assessed with the full spectrum attention that processed everything at once. What she was looking at was a man who had handed her a microphone 8 months ago and had spent every day since then revising his understanding of what that moment had cost him and what it had taught him. A man who had run an honest accounting of himself and not flinched at the number. "You're here to learn to see," she said. "Most operators spend their whole careers learning to act. You're already exceptional at acting. The thing you don't know how to do, the thing that nearly got you on that range, is see." She paused. "I have a candidate I want you to watch. I'm not going to tell you anything about her. I want to know what you see when you look at her with nothing to go on but your own eyes." She walked him to the observation room. Candidate 11 was in the assessment yard running a clearance evolution with two other candidates, and she was doing what she always did, which was position herself where she was most useful, rather than most visible move with an economy that did not announce itself, see the room at a level of resolution that the candidates around her did not match. Marcus watched her for a long time. Sarah watched him watch. And after 4 full minutes in which Marcus said nothing, and his face did the slow work of a man learning to look at a person without the assumptions that had always done his looking for him, he said quietly, "That one." "Why?" "Because she's the only one in the yard who isn't trying to be seen," he said. "Everyone else is running the evolution like they know they're being watched. She's running it like the evolution is the only thing that exists." He paused. "And she's better than both of the people she's working with, and neither of them has noticed because she hasn't done anything to make them notice. She just keeps being in the right place at the right time, and they think it's luck." Sarah said nothing for a moment. "That's it," she said. "That's the whole thing. That's what you didn't see on the range." Marcus looked at the candidate in the yard. Then he looked at Sarah. "How long did it take you to learn to see it?" he asked. "I didn't learn to see it," she said. "I was it. The seeing came later when I had to find other people who were it." She looked at him. "You're never going to be it, Sergeant. That door's closed. You're too good at being seen, and you always will be. But you can learn to see it, and that's worth as much as being it because the program needs both, and there are a lot more people who can be it than there are people who can find them." He absorbed this. "So I'm a scout." "You're a hunter," she said. "There's a difference. A scout finds what he's told to look for. A hunter finds what nobody else can see." She paused. "Taggart's a hunter. He found me from 30 feet away based on a 7-year-old memory. That's rarer than the still place. I have 11 candidates who carry the still place. I have 2 people in the world I trust to find them." "Ramirez," Marcus said. "Ramirez," she confirmed. "And now, maybe you." The first cohort graduated 9 weeks later. There was no ceremony. There were no decorations pinned in a yard in front of assembled teams. No general rolling back his sleeve to reveal a serpent eating its tail. No salutes held 1 beat longer than protocol required. The program did not graduate operators that way because the entire point of the program was that its operators did not exist, and you could not hold a ceremony for people who did not exist. What happened instead was quieter and in a way that Sarah understood and most people never would more meaningful. 7 candidates remained. Of the original 15, 4 had washed to the second tier earlier, returning to their units better than they had left. 4 more had advanced through the assessment phase but had revealed under the sustained pressure of the program's deeper evolutions that they carried the still place in flashes, but not consistently, that they could find it under some conditions but lost it under others. And the program could not afford operators who could only see clearly when the conditions were right because the conditions were never right. 7 remained. The same number that Ghost Unit had carried, though Sarah had not engineered that and noted it only afterward, the way a person notices a pattern that the universe assembles without being asked. On the last night, she gathered the 7 in the operations building, and for the first time since they had arrived, she told them her name. Not the cover name, not the rank on the door. Her name and the name of the unit she had served in, and the name said carefully, said with the weight that the names deserved, of the 2 operators who had not survived the burning of that unit, whose doctrine the 7 of them had been learning for 16 weeks without knowing whose doctrine it was. She told them about Ghost Unit, 7 operators, 43 confirmed operations, 0 mission failures. She told them about the still place and gave it the name she had only ever used privately because they had earned the private name. She told them that they had been selected not for what they could do, but for what they were, and that what they were had probably been a thing their commanders complained about and their peers underestimated, and the world had told them. In 100 small ways across their whole lives was a deficiency. It was never a deficiency, she said. It was the thing. It was always the thing. The world just didn't have a use for it that it was willing to admit existed. She looked at the 7 of them, arranged in the loose, unself-conscious way of people who had stopped performing for each other weeks ago. You've spent your whole lives being handed microphones by people who thought you were irrelevant. Every one of you knew exactly what to do with the microphone and exactly when not to use it. That's why you're here. That's the only reason anyone is ever here. She reached into her pocket. She produced the coin, the serpent eating its tail. 7 stars, 3 and 4, the pattern she had known since the first day she understood what she had become. The coin that the unit's first operational lead had carried for 4 years, that he had given to Morrison when the protocol was activated, that Morrison had given to her 8 months ago, with the instruction to pass it to whoever picked up what ghost unit left behind. She set it on the table in the center of the room. This coin is older than the unit you're joining, she said. It belonged to the first person who did what you're about to do. He carried it through 4 years of work that no one will ever read about, and then he gave it forward because the work outlasts the people who do it, and the only thing that matters is that it gets passed to the right hands. She paused. I'm not going to give it to one of you. Not yet. One of you is going to earn it the way I earned it, by becoming the person the unit can't function without. And when that happens, and it will, because the thing that makes one of you that person is already in the room, I just don't know which of you yet, I'll set it down again, and the cycle continues. She left the coin on the table. The 7 of them looked at it. None of them reached for it. That was the answer in a way that they understood it was not to be reached for, that the reaching was the disqualification, that the coin came to the person who never tried to take it. Candidate 11 looked at the coin the longest. She did not reach for it either. But Sarah, watching her, saw the thing she had been looking for since the first morning she had watched 11 run the perimeter in the dark. She saw a person who understood completely, and without being told that the coin was not a prize. It was a weight. It was the heaviest thing in the room, heavier than it looked, the way things that carry what they carry always are. And 11 looked at the weight and did not flinch from it and did not reach for it, and simply received the fact of it the way she received everything fully, without performance, with the calibrated stillness of a person who had made her peace with what she was a long time before anyone else had figured out what to call it. That was the one. Sarah did not say so. It was too early, and saying so would change it, and the whole point was that the person became the person without anyone telling them they were supposed to. But she knew the way, she knew the wind 3 seconds before it shifted, the way she knew a shot would land before she fired it. She knew. Later, after the 7 had gone to their quarters and the building had emptied, Sarah stood at the window of the operations building and watched the dark, the way she had watched the dark on every base she had ever occupied. Ramirez came in. He did not bring coffee this time. He stood beside her at the window and they watched the dark together, 2 people who had built something out of nothing, who had taken a doctrine that someone had tried to erase and given it to 7 people who would carry it forward into a world that would never know they existed. Morrison called, Ramirez said. The network the contact identified, they've rolled up 11 of the 14 names. The last 3 are a matter of time. Sarah nodded. She did not say anything about the 2 operators they had lost. There was nothing to say that the silence didn't say better. He also said, Ramirez continued, that the 2nd cohort is approved. He wants selection to begin in 90 days. It already has, Sarah said. Marcus flagged 3 candidates before he left. Taggart sent 2. There's a candidate in a logistics unit in Germany that I've been watching for 6 weeks, she paused. Selection never stops. That's the thing people don't understand about this. It's not a process you run when you need operators. It's a way of looking at the world that you never turn off. Every room you walk into, you're looking for the person nobody else sees. Ramirez was quiet for a moment. You found me in a room nobody was looking at, he said. 80 months ago, I was an intelligence specialist that people consistently underestimated accessing a file I wasn't supposed to be able to reach. I know, Sarah said. You let me find the access block. I let you find the door, she said. You decided to walk through it. That part was always yours. She looked at him. I didn't recruit you, Ramirez. I just stopped being invisible long enough for you to see something, and then I watched what you did with it. Everything since then has been you. He absorbed this. Outside, the first light was beginning to gray the eastern ridgeline, and somewhere in the candidate barracks, a single figure was probably already awake, lacing her boots in the dark, getting ready to run a perimeter road that no one had told her to run, the same way in every condition. Because the work was the point, and the audience had never been part of the calculation. 7 operators, Ramirez said quietly. 2 gone, 5 safe, 1 building what came next. And 7 more, Sarah said. Who'll build what comes after that? And 7 after them. That's the whole design. That's what they tried to erase and couldn't, because you can erase a name in a file, but you can't erase a way of seeing the world once you've given it to enough people. She looked at the coin still sitting on the table in the center of the empty room, waiting for the hands that would earn it. They thought they were burning a unit. They were planting a seed. They just didn't know which one of us was the seed. She turned from the window. She picked up her field notebook, the same kind she always carried, waterproof cover, a page of numbers that meant nothing to anyone who didn't know how to read them. And she made a single note, the way she had made a single note on a range 8 months ago before she walked to a line and put 5 rounds through one hole. 3 letters, a candidate designation, and beside it a small mark. Not a star. Not yet. The stars came later, after the names were earned, after the operators became the operators they were always going to be. But a mark, a first mark, the beginning of a record that would outlast every official document her name had ever been attached to. She closed the notebook. Outside, the light came up over the high desert, and a facility with no name began to wake, and 7 people who did not officially exist got ready to spend another day becoming the thing that the world had always underestimated and would never see coming. That was the doctrine. That was the legacy. That was what 7 stars had always meant and what they would always mean in every cohort, in every facility, with no name in every room where someone walked in carrying any roll and any rifle, and the quiet, calibrated certainty of a person who had already decided before anyone else knew there was a decision to make exactly where the shot was going to land. Sarah Kane had not come to build something for herself. She had come to build something that did not need her. And as the light came up over the desert and the 7 of them began their day, she understood with the particular clarity that came at the end of a long calculation, when the answer arrives and is better than the alternatives you had been carrying, that she had finally done it. The work would outlast her now. It had hands to carry it. And somewhere in the candidate barracks, a young woman whose commander had once written that she lacked command presence and tended to recede, was lacing her boots in the dark, getting ready to run, not knowing yet that a coin was waiting for her, not knowing yet that she was the seed, knowing only that the work was in front of her, and the work was the point, and the rest of it, the recognition, the names, the stars, had never been part of the calculation. She would earn the coin, and when she did, she would set it down again, and the cycle would continue exactly as it was designed to, long after the names beneath the stars were no longer spoken aloud in any room that carried an unclassified header. That was the most precise operation Sarah Kane had ever run. It would take 20 years to confirm the result. She had never minded waiting for a shot to land.